Welcome to another exciting talk in the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival, held online this year, though very much a London event. And today, I think we're bringing together once again more concerns of Khushwant Singh when we talk about crossing borders. Because one thing that really does cross borders is a detective novel. And, you know, one of those things in India, it's always wonderful to hear, you know, Sherlock Holmes seems to have his own incarnation in India. And our British author, Lord Geoffrey Archer, he too is an international figure who has an enormous fan following in India. Today, he's going to be talking, well, do I have to introduce Geoffrey Archer? I suppose I ought to out of politeness, but he's published in 97 countries, which is really crossing borders, translated into 33 different languages, really one of the world's best-selling authors, as his sales now are about 275 million copies of his books, an author who really crosses borders. And he's talking today to Mihir Bose, who is based here in London and writes for many publications, as well as being a broadcast journalist and author of more than 30 books. His most recent book being The Nine Waves, The Extraordinary Story of Indian Cricket. He's another of the regular features here at the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival in London. But today they're talking about Geoffrey Archer's most recent book, Over My Dead Body, which features his detective sergeant William Warwick of the London Met. The London Met, perhaps now as well known around the world as they are to us here in London itself. So a big welcome to Lord Geoffrey Archer and Mihir Bose.
Well, it's a great pleasure talking to Geoffrey Archer, who's in Spain. I'm in London in my loft here in Shepherd's Bush. Geoffrey is breaking into his siesta to talk to us. Geoffrey, before I begin, let me tell you a little anecdote which took place over lunch, where my dear wife read me out from your book, Over My Dead Body, the exchange between your detective, Chief Inspector William Warwick, and James Buchanan. And in fact, she played the audible version of it, and the exchange, James Buchanan being a young man who doesn't want to be the president of America or anything like that, because he wants to be the head of the FBI and can get direct access to the president. And it was absolutely fascinating. And at the end of it, she said, "This is an absolute page turner." She was the first one in the family to read it, may I say. And this is in the same class as Dick Francis. There can be no higher praise for my wife than that. She's into equestrian sport, and Dick Francis books are the one books I cannot take to the charity shop, despite my great desire to reduce the number of books in my house. Now, the way you actually, let's talk about that conversation, because it's at the start of this book. The way you frame it is so fascinating. And as you were writing it, what was going through your mind when you were writing it as the opening lines of your book?
Well, one of the problems one has if you're doing several books with the same characters, and it's not a sequel, you can pick up any of the books and they should work in their own right. But one of the problems is you need an opening that will capture the reader's imagination. And I decided to put my hero, William Warwick, and his remarkable wife, Beth, on holiday. I then decided to put them on a ship. Now, we've discussed this before in the past, Mihir, and I don't know where I'm going. So when I put him on the ship and I had her going to her Pilates class in the morning and him sitting having a drink looking out to sea, along comes a young man who's hoping to go to Harvard, but has already worked out that this man is a detective. And because after Harvard, he wants to join the FBI, he decides, he says to the, can I sit with you? And William says yes. And they have that conversation where the young man says, "You're not a bank manager. You're not a taxi driver. What's amazing is you're a detective. But what's a detective doing in first class?" Now, the writer, or in my case, I take that to where, and I just follow where it's going. So the answer to your question is, along came the young man, James Buchanan. I then decided that he would be the grandson of the owner of the ship. I then decided that his grandfather, Hamish Buchanan, would be murdered on the ship. And immediately the two of them, the grandson just waiting to go up to Harvard, and this incredible detective, William Warwick, would solve the mystery of who had murdered the owner of the ship. But, Maya, I then had to have a triple twist once they had.
You described how you don't know where you're going. So when you're now in the middle of writing your next book, as you always do, you go to Spain and you write in blocks. When you set out to write, do you sketch out a plan of the basic outline of the book, or does it begin with a blank screen and then you say, right, William Warwick sets off? How does it work?
Well, I've decided initially that William, on leaving school, would go into the Metropolitan Police, and each book he would conquer, he would be involved in a different kind of crime, and he would be a different rank. So book one, he's a detective constable dealing with art fraud. In book two, he becomes a sergeant and is dealing with drugs. In book three, he becomes an inspector and is dealing with police corruption. In book four, the one you have in front of you, he's a chief inspector and he's dealing with murder. Now, to answer your question, I am sitting over in my office on the other side of the house, and I am into royalty protection because he's moved up to superintendent. So each book will have a new rank, and each book will have a new subject. And if I can live to the age of 85, because I'm 82, Mayor, if I can live...
I thought you were 55.
Well, let's pass at 55, quite right. He will become the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. And I will have done 8 books, taking him from constable on the beat to commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. And in each book, he will tackle a different type of crime.
Right. You've sketched it out very well. And you said you don't know where it will take you. But sometimes do your characters take you to places you don't want to go or make you uncomfortable?
Very good question. I can give you an example in the Clifton Chronicles where the wicked Lady Virginia, I was determined to get rid of the wicked Lady Virginia or do her down. And she's in the witness box and she's up against my heroine, Emma, who's Emma Clifton. And there is a legal battle between them. So, of course, I want Emma to win. And the morning I got out of bed that morning, I'm going to kill Virginia and Emma is going to win. And Virginia gets into the witness box up against a leading QC, one of Britain's leading QCs. And he asks a question. And I wrote the question down, Mahir. I wrote the question down. And then the answer was, if you can't do better than that, I should try again. And she, wait a minute. Well, okay, well, I've got to move on to the next question. So I wrote the next line and she bashes that one back. And by the end of the 5 pages of the cross-examination, she had killed the QC, which was exactly opposite to what I intended when I got up at 6 o'clock that morning. So the answer to your question is, it goes where it takes me.
So in effect, your characters can take you over in that sense.
Oh, very much indeed. And some become more powerful and more interesting. I remember when I wrote The Prodigal Daughter, the story of the first woman president of the United States, and still, Maya, they haven't woken up and had one. And I wrote the story of the first woman president of the United States. I decided that Abel Rosnowski's daughter, Florentina, would have to have, living in New York, would have to have an English tutor, an English teacher. And she has this amazing Miss Treadgold. And Miss Treadgold comes over, and I got her in my mind here for 5 pages maximum. In she comes, does her job, gets out. 173 pages later, she gets back on the boat and goes home. So you're quite right. I go where they take me.
And in that process of going where they take you, have you had uncomfortable journeys?
Yes, because sometimes, as in the case of Lady Virginia, you want to get rid of them. I mean, I had a bit of problem with this because the publishers kept saying, everybody loves Lady Virginia. And I said, well, I rather like to get rid of her. No, no, you have to keep her. So yes, you do sometimes. And there was a case I wrote a book, As the Crow Flies, where my hero, Charlie Trumper, born in the East End of London as a barrow boy, and the story, it's a simple story. When you say, do you know where you're going? I knew he was going to be a barrow boy in the East End of London and would end up in the House of Lords. That's all I knew. And yes, I did in that particular book have a major problem because it took me to, he needed to find something out in order to save his life, his fortune, everything. And he knew there was one person alive who could give him that answer. And she was in a nursing home in Australia. So he gets on a plane, he goes to Australia, he gets to the nursing home, the door is open, and he says to the matron, I've come to see Mrs. So-and-so. And she says, well, I'm very, very sorry. She died last week. Now, I had to get myself out of that problem because I liked the idea that after all his fighting to find out the thing that would save him, he was smashed at the last moment. And my very, very great editor of many years ago now no longer with us, the great Corley Smith, who edited J.D. Salinger, a truly great editor, said, Geoffrey, if you've got a problem like that, don't avoid it. The problem will not be solved by the reader. It has to be solved by you. Don't find the easy way out, in which case the matron would have said, oh, yes, do come in. I'll take you to her. That's the easy way out. He said, you've stuffed yourself. Now get yourself out of that corner. And I walked round a golf course for 3 days.
Huh.
Trying to work out how, and then I got it. You get it sometimes in a second, in a split second it comes. You get the basic idea, and then it takes a couple more hours perhaps to see how you use that basic idea. And it was very simple indeed. I turned her into a Scottish matron, and she said, as you've come all this way, would you be kind enough to take this letter back to England? Because it will save the post. So she hands him the letter and he reads the letter on the plane and everything is explained.
So tell me, what is it about writers like you who want to kill one of their characters? And I'm thinking, well, even kill their leading character. And I'm thinking about Arthur Conan Doyle actually killing Sherlock Holmes, then resurrecting him. Agatha Christie giving Poirot a last role. What is it? Is it that you get tired of it? Is it that you feel, oh, I've had enough of him. He's invaded my space. What is it? I mean, the character almost becomes a human being who's with you.
Well, we know in the case of Agatha Christie and in the case of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, we know historically that their publishers went down to their house, sat with them and said, the public want them alive. And he pointed out that they're dead. In the case of Conan Doyle, he said, well, revive him. And he did. And in the case of, it's even funnier with Poirot, in my view. And I've discussed this with that wonderful actor, David Suchet. We were at the same school and are friends. And I discussed it with him. It's almost more fascinating with playing Poirot, because if you look carefully, Mahir, and you mustn't look carefully, he's about 130 on his last page. And he's been around forever. And because the public loved him, she kept him going. But I don't know how many books there are, 50, 60 of them. And you couldn't have done all those cases in 20 years. But what a wonderful character. And yes, now in my own case, Yes, I felt originally with the Clifton Chronicles, it was good for 3 books. And then I got them to 3 books and they were only 40. So the publisher said, for heaven's sake, keep going. So I then got to 5 books and they were around 60, and I could see the ending. I could see that Harry would eventually die and write his last book, and I could see that Emma was going to become a government minister, a woman government minister in a conservative government, and I could see all that, and that got me into the 70s. Now, the problem with the 70s, when they get to the 70s, you're not meant to be doing as much as you used to do. So frankly, 7 books was enough. I got to the end. I thought I was very happy when it was the end of the 7 books. But in answer to your question, that was originally meant to be 3 books.
We talked about Agatha Christie and Arthur Conan Doyle. What is interesting about them is that their central detective character actually is always somebody who proves Scotland Yard detectives to be idiots. Poirot is infinitely superior to Inspector Japp. Sherlock Holmes is, the detective hardly features. He's that individual loner. Poirot is actually an extraordinary character in the sense that the Belgium comes over and teaches the English how to be a detective. In your case, what you've done is you've made a Scotland Yard detective into the central figure, and in a way, you are treading a very different line to those detective fiction writers who've been part of the British tradition for almost 100 years. Were you aware when you started, because detective fiction is not the first thing you wrote, when you started on this, that you were doing something that, if you like, the great genre of detective fiction writing in Britain hadn't done?
Well, it's kind of you to say so, and indeed, the head of the crime club in England said that the idea of a detective going from constable to commissioner in 8 books and having 8 different crimes to solve, 8 different types of crimes. He said, I cannot think why it hasn't been thought of years ago. This was the head of the crime. And the truth is, I did want to go down a different route. And I did like the idea of this very clever young man saying to his father, a distinguished QC, no, I'm not going to read law at Cambridge. I'm going to go to London University and I'm going to become a constable on the beat. So that was the route I was going. And I hadn't thought of it quite in the way you've expressed it. But actually, now you've said it that way, Mahir, I'm rather glad that I went down a completely different route. Now, the detective in question is based on a man called Detective Chief Superintendent John Sutherland, who was head of the murder squad and sadly had a mental breakdown in what he described himself in his brilliant book as one murder too many. Now, I met him at an Advent Carol service in London for the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and he was reading one of the lessons. And I had a word with him afterwards and said, look, I'm just starting these books about William Warwick, and as far as I can see, you are William Warwick. And you've had a brilliant career. You got to Detective Chief Superintendent before you were 40, absolutely remarkable. And will you be my chief researcher? And he turned me down because he said he was recovering, quite rightly, recovering from this terrible experience. And I got halfway through. And then I rang him up, I don't know, 6-9 months later and said, do you feel any different? He said, yeah, I feel a lot better, he said, and I'd rather like to take up the challenge. So when I finished about the 5th or 6th draft, I sent it to him and a remarkable lady called Detective Sergeant Michelle Roycroft, who was in the drug squad for 25 years and is retired as well. And they both get the 5th or 6th draft. And what they do is they correct silly mistakes. Give you an example of one this afternoon, Mayor. One this afternoon, where I'm now on the 7th, 8th, and 9th draft. So I've got their remarks. And they will change perhaps just one word. For example, I said at the end of one thing, and you will do X and Y. And they said, no, you have to put the words, he was cautioned, not he had the rights read out to him. I read he said, no, that's American. You've got to say he was arrested and then cautioned. So those 4 words were changed to arrested and cautioned, because reading out his rights was not correct. So it's an example of something that happened this afternoon where I changed 4 words. So they're always looking, because if you get it wrong, I'll get thousands of emails saying, dear Jeffrey, you don't know the difference between America and Britain. It's time you took up your research a bit more seriously. So I'm very lucky to have these 2 remarkable former police officers who do just that. Just occasionally, if I'm very lucky, they come up with an anecdote as well that has happened in their life. The best one I ever remember, and I haven't been able to use yet, and I know it to be true, but I haven't been able to use it, is Michelle, who's about, I don't know, 5'8", now a former officer. She told me of a case where she was chasing a drug baron and dived into the top of the roof of his car and stopped him driving. Well, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have had the guts to do that. Count me out on that one. But she clearly did it. And I haven't yet been able to get it into a book.
Well, you clearly share with another great British writer, Somerset Maugham, who said you've got to constantly polish your work. So, I mean, you know, the drafts have to go on and on. But is there a process where you say, no, it's got to stop now? Or you are, when you submit the manuscript or typescript to your publisher, you finally feel it can't be bettered?
It's a very interesting question, because when you say can't be bettered, you can only do as well as you can do. Someone else may feel even then it's not good enough. That's fine. You must do the best you can do, which is why I go on to about 14 drafts. And if someone says, well, it's not very good, Jeffrey, that's fine. I can't do anything. I have to tell myself it's the best I can do. Now, in the case of Somerset Maugham, you raise a very interesting case there.
And I thought he was a great writer, by the way. I was brought up to believe. I know nobody remembers him now.
Well, it's sad, because I think The Bell Ringer is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And
The Rain as a short story is one of the great short stories. Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. And Mr. Know-All is terrific. So I learnt a lot from him. I've written 92 short stories myself and consider him H.H. Munro, Saki, Maupassant, O. Henry. I think these are the great short story writers. Now, in your own country, of course, I include an absolute giant in R.K. Narayan. I think he's one of the great short story writers of all time. And how he didn't get the Nobel Prize is a comment on the Nobel Prize committee, not on Mr. R.K. Narayan. His ability to take an unimportant tax collector living in a small village in India and bring him to life and demand you turn the pages to find out what this insignificant man has been up to is close to genius.
But I mean, you started off not by writing detective fiction. You started off, and you know, your famous first novel, Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less. When you started that, were you thinking that this is where you would end up? Were you imagining? Were you hoping? What was your ambition? What would you have then said? I've done well.
It's a very fair question, because after that hold your breath, Mahir, if 16 publishers turned down Not a Penny Less, the 17th publisher, Jonathan Cape, managed 3,000 copies in hardback, and they only just sold. And my wife said, isn't it time you got a proper job? But it all changed when I wrote Cain and Abel. The whole world changed for me when and now in your country, I see the Indian Times think 100 million people have read Cain and Abel in India. It seems impossible, but 50 million in India, 100 million in the whole world.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, you've always been a great story writer. You can tell a story, which is what it's all about, and you can tell it, and you can make believable characters where you believe that these people are there next to you. You know, that's been your great great virtue, great ability, or right from the beginning. I remember speaking to Richard Cohen about you, who edited your books, and what a great story writer you were, what a great storyteller you were, which is not a gift many people have. And we were talking about Somerset Maugham. I think Somerset Maugham had that capability.
Yeah, but that's the point, if I may interrupt you, Mayor. You're making the point yourself. It's a gift, to use your words. It's a gift. You can't pop down to Marks and Spencer's and order a couple of stories. It's a gift, like playing the violin, like being an opera singer, like being an Olympic athlete. It's a gift.
Did you always have it as a child?
Well, I was always, I think, a raconteur, and I've always loved public speaking. So I wasn't aware that I had it until I put pen to paper.
And what made you, I mean, you've written a range of things. You've written short stories, you've written plays. Normally writers, if they're successful, stick to one genre. What made you diversify in such a way?
Well, I love the theatre. I go to theatre, when I'm in London, I'll go to the theatre twice a week. I'm a big theatre fan. I can even tell you the 2 shows I saw the week before I flew out to Spain. That's how much. I can even tell you the show I'm going to see the day I fly back. That's how much I love the theatre. So writing 3 plays was quite natural. But don't forget, Mahir, I'm 82 years old. I've had a long enough life to experiment with other forms of writing.
One point, your blurb in your book mentions your great interests, talks about your passionate interest in arts, but it doesn't mention an interest of yours that I'm very well aware of, and that is where we've always met, your interest in sport, in cricket. The point I'm trying to make to you here is, does this not reflect something? I've lived in England now half a century, and it's always struck me, and this is even more true of India, Indians are even more pedantic than the British ever will be. And that there is this difference between arties and hearties, which is not true in America. One of my all-time favorite authors is David Halberstam, a great New York Times journalist, sadly died in a car crash, wrote some brilliant books, who actually wrote a book on baseball, covered baseball. Do you feel that in Britain, despite the fact that you support a minor county, Somerset, not Surrey, the greatest cricket county in the world, but do you feel that because of the fact that there is a difference between arties and hearties, and to a certain extent you have not had the sort of attention on the literary pages that you should have had?
Well, it's very kind of you to say so. And I remember sitting with you at Lord's and you discussing this in a very serious way. And I have never forgot that you said very kindly, I told my wife that night, I reported back to my wife that night, that you said I did deserve to be treated in the same way as some of the giants of the past. I've never forgotten that. And it was very kind of you. But the answer
that is true.
It's very kind. I answered your cricket point. I love cricket. I've written some short stories on cricket, and I've included it in the occasional novel, but not least in the latest one, it's included. But a whole book on cricket. It's like Indians very kindly come up to me in the street and say, "We want your great Indian novel." And I say, "Wait a moment, I'm an Englishman. If I tried to write the great English novel, you'd fall about laughing." I said, "I love the Indians and I come as often as I can. And of course I sit with idiots like you because you and I are as mad about cricket. I mean, we both have this passion for cricket, and God help us when we sit next together when England are playing India. I avoid you when India are playing India. But I don't feel confident enough, Meher, to actually write a book on cricket. And don't forget, you've spent your life as one of the leading sports writers, and you've written books, amazing books on the history of Indian cricket. So I might equally say to you, where's your novel?
I started off wanting to be a novelist, but I couldn't write. I couldn't create a character. But the point is, what the point here is that you have, therefore, had you been an American, you would have been not treated on the literary pages as if you were just a popular fiction writer. That's the point I'm trying to get at.
Yes, I think you're right. It's kind of you to say so. I've won awards in France, in Italy, in the United States and Ireland. I've never won anything in England.
I mean, and that is a reflection of England, and you know, as I said, in India it's even more so, because I think the pedantry in India is such. You know, I find myself in India, because I've written history books as well, and not just sports books. Because I'm not an academic, the academics say, well, you know, your books have not been peer reviewed. But that is an Indian story. Let's talk a bit about what you've had a multifaceted career. You've been a politician, you're still a member of the House of Lords. What took you into writing? What made you decide that you would become a writer? I know everybody says there's a writer in everybody, but fortunately not everybody writes. So what made you think that you wanted to write, and B, that you could be a writer? What gave you that strength, inner strength?
It was a mistake, Mahir. I was a
Really?
member of the British House of Commons. I entered the House at far too young an age. I entered at 29, assumed I was going to be Prime Minister. What was going to stop me? Made a complete bloody fool of myself, investing in a company called Aquablast, where I lost everything I'd put in and lost some borrowed money as well. I left the House when the election came up. I couldn't get a job, and I sat down and wrote Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less, thinking it was an interesting story. 4 young men who've lost their fortune and between them decide to steal it back, but they mustn't go over the top because that would be stealing. They're only allowed to take exactly what's been stolen from them. And I suppose I was silly enough to think it would be a bestseller. So I rushed down on the day it was published to get my Sunday Times, very disappointed I wasn't in the top 10. I rushed down the following week, very disappointed to find I was not in the top 10. And they refused to tell me that I actually wasn't in the top 100. So I think going on was the tough decision. And I say to young writers now, I didn't make it until my 3rd book. Don't assume you'll be a bestseller with your 3rd book. The public have got to get to know you and trust you. And if that works, you will grow and grow and grow.
A few years ago, it was said that book writing is dead, is dying. You know, the young generation don't. My daughter, for instance, though I've been a journalist, doesn't read hard printed copies of papers. I can't do without hard printed copies of papers, and I might say that the first thing I turn to is the back pages, the sports pages. That's what I grew up with before I come to the rest of the paper. But but do you now? The pandemic seems to suggest that book reading has increased. The book sales have gone up, that people actually want hard copy. How do you see the book trade as a writer, as such a well-established writer selling so many copies? Do you ever see people not buying copies of books?
I hope not. The other point you make is a fascinating one, because you're quite right. During the 2 years when we were all locked up, I certainly bought more books and read more books than I ever have done. But there's still damn good value for money, and which is a start. And I think the answer to your question is what you said as a fact. Book sales have not gone down. So I'm rather hoping you're right. I confess that people aren't reading books the length they used to be. And I always give the example that the Count of Monte Cristo is about 1,700 pages. And there are still people writing books that are 800 or 900 pages, whereas it looks as if the general public now want to read books that are somewhere between 300 and 400 pages. But I think for sheer entertainment, you do get 7, 8, 9, 10 hours, which you don't get in a film. You don't get in a play.
And I think I prefer, I know a friend of mine read Kindle, but I still prefer a hard copy that you can go back to. And talking of weighty books, I mean, and you're part of that great classic generation of British writers. You know, Dickens would not care about how big the book was, but his books were, of course, published in book form after they'd been serialized in various magazines.
Well, your point is well made, because if you look at I don't know, Bleak House, that's probably 700 pages. But if you look at the book that's actually sold more than any of his wonderful A Tale of Two Cities, I think it's about 250 pages. And I'm glad to hear you put it that way. I'd never quite put it that way myself. He darn well did what he wanted to do, and the public didn't mind because he was a genius. So that's a very interesting point you make, that he just did what he wanted to do. And certainly he's the greatest writer, storyteller in the history of my country. And he's still, and what's wonderful about him is he translates onto the screen. So I love a Dickens story on a screen.
And I must say, A Tale of Two Cities, for me, I read it a long time ago, is one of the greatest novels I've ever read, the way it ends and the way it goes on. But tell me, who is the writer, when you were growing up, who's the writer that inspired you most, the one that you turned to and said, this man, or if it was a woman, is absolutely brilliant?
Well, my mother was a journalist, and she made me read when I was young. I was actually more interested in captaining the England cricket team. It was a minor disadvantage that I couldn't bat, bowl, or field, but my mother kept me at it. And I would say I began, and you're almost old enough, Mahir, to remember, I began with Rushmore Compton, and so the William books were wonderful for me. And then I moved on. I suppose as a young man, Ian Fleming, damn good storyteller. Again, underrated as a writer. They all try to do what he's doing, but they don't succeed. His books are amazing. But in old age, and you must tell me yours so that I can read them tonight. In old age, and by that I mean 60, and I'm now 82. In old age, I fell in love with Stefan Zweig.
Oh,
I think Beware of Pity is a masterpiece. And indeed, you as a non-fiction writer will greatly admire his non-fiction work, because he's that genius who can do both.
You mentioned Stephen Zweig. You know, I once got Roy Hodgson, who's written the foreword to my book that's just come out on Sport and Race, to come and speak at the Reform Club. Roy, of course, made the mistake of becoming a member of the Garrick, but that's a different story. And when we asked him what was his favorite,
no. You misheard me, Mahir. No. Stefan Zweig.
Yes, Stefan Zweig. Yes, and Roy Hodgson thought he was the best writer. You know, his favorite novelist.
Who did? Sorry.
As Roy Hodgson, the England football manager.
Did he?
Well,
he's a very intelligent man, isn't he? I talk about my love of the theatre. The only time I ever see Roy is at the theatre. He loves the theatre, and he's very well read.
Absolutely.
And a thoroughly nice chap.
And when he mentioned his name, there were some members of the Reform Club who hadn't really read his books and things like that. And it's really interesting you mentioned William books, because though I was brought up in India, I was brought up on English literature, and I read Biggles and William books were. William books were given to me by the man I call my grandfather. They was my father's uncle, and I came to England thinking everybody had a cook. So I take it you grew up with having a cook in your house. I take it, Jeffrey.
But surely, as a good Indian, you were brought up on P.G. Wodehouse.
Absolutely, P.G. Wodehouse. I mean, I thought everybody in England had a valet who served fish every day. But there we are. Now, tell me, you've spoken about cricket. Would you have given up all your success to have played for England and scored a century at Lord's?
It's a very hard question to answer, because I remember a very intelligent man saying to me when I was a young man, when you achieve something, you want something different. And if you had that something different, you'd want what you had achieved. I'd love to have scored a century at Lord's. If you're asking me to give up all the books to play for one century at Lord's, no. If you ask me, would you like to be Rahul Dravid? The answer is yes. Because he's the most beautiful stroke player I think I've ever seen. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Gavaskar, and of course we all admire Tendulkar. but Dravid for me. And that day when he and VVS Laxman held on against the Australians. I mean, my love of cricket is proved by the fact that I look upon that as an Englishman, as one of the great days in the history of cricket. So no, I'd like to have been Prime Minister. I'd like to have been captain of the England cricket team. And I'd like to have had 7 number 1s on the New York Times. Well, I'll settle for one of those.
Well, funnily you mentioned Gavaskar. I went to school with him. I was a couple of years his senior, and I remember as a sort of, a boy in senior school looking down on this little boy in shorts practicing his forward defensive, and we laughed at him. And we went to a Jesuit school, and Father Fritz, who took us for English and sports, said, "That boy will play for India. You load of washouts you don't know," which turned out to be true. Now, we talked a bit about politics.
Actually, his name came up at lunch today. If you had to send a batsman to the crease when you were in trouble, who would it be? And I said without hesitation, Sunil Gavaskar.
Oh yes, and he's a very nice guy as well. He's a very straightforward guy. He's a very nice guy. Talking of politics, you were involved in politics. You're still involved in politics. Politics, in particularly what is happening with in recent times with members of parliament and the stories that are coming out, suggest that the people who are of good caliber are not going into politics. Would you accept that? And if that is the case, why is that the case? One thinks of, the best people in the land should be going into politics. That's not just true of Britain. It's true of other countries. You think of America, you think of India. Why is it that it is not attracting the best and the good?
I can best describe this when I was asked some time ago to speak. So it's not right up to date, but 15 years ago, I was asked to speak to the Kit Kat Club in England, which is for women who've achieved managing director, chairman, or chief executive before the age of 40. And the mayor, the Lord Mayor, rang me up and said, "We want you to address them, Geoffrey." And I couldn't. I was in heaven, Mayor. I mean, 200 women in one room, all of them cleverer than me. I was in heaven. And off I go. And there was one particular girl I will never forget, lady and woman, I will never forget the rest of my life. She's standing at the back and she's having a row with me on a big political subject at the time. And I suddenly had enough of it and said, "Why don't you go into the House of Commons? Why don't you serve your country? Why don't you play a part in politics?" And she said, "Geoffrey, I earn £250,000 a year, and I have 2 boyfriends at the moment, and don't want to see either of their names on the front page of the Daily Mail." And I think that answers your question.
But is this a fault perhaps of my tribe journalism, that we are now reporting more personal stories than we used to? When I went into journalism all those years ago, and I qualified as a chartered accountant, my father said there's no money in journalism. He was right. But the point is that that stage, what was in the private life of individuals was not something that you cared about. You cared about what the policies were, what the issues were. Is this because we have trivialized? Our world is more trivialized than it was when we were young.
Well, if that is true, Mahir, it's because that is what the public want. The journalist can't write an article that no one wants to read. And in England at the moment, we've got Wayne Rooney in court against Vardy, and it's on the front pages every day. I happen to think and it's getting about the same coverage as Ukraine. Well, there is a subtle difference in its importance. But that's the world we now live in. Celebrity, TikTok, all these things. It's a new world that you and I don't fully understand. But now, taking your own comment about your own profession. Wow, when I was at Oxford, the very best people wanted to be journalists. Nowadays, it's very hard to get a job in journalism. The newspapers are not selling, as you well know. The numbers are going down. Newscasts on television are lucky if they get 40,000 people watching them, very lucky. And so your world has changed as well. And you make the point, when you were a young man, going into journalism was a big deal. It's not that attractive at the moment.
But I mean, this of course is part of a changing world that we can't do anything about. Do you feel, looking back, that you have lived in the best of times, or would you have liked to be a young man now at 18?
Well, I'd like to be a young man now, only because I'm an old man now. But I have a wonderful housekeeper called Lena. She's Bulgarian, and I'm guessing 24 years old. And she saw a picture of Mary and myself in my Oxford days when I was a runner. She saw a picture of that and she said, how wonderful. And I thought she was referring to the fact that we were two young people at Oxford. She wasn't, because I asked her to say, what do you mean? And she said, oh, wonderful to have been born after the Second World War and before COVID. And that I thought was very interesting. And I asked her to go on. And what she was clearly saying was a young person nowadays lives in a very, very changing world, a very dangerous world. And actually, I think the words you used were a golden age. Perhaps between 1950 and 2000, 2010, perhaps that was a golden age.
And we're also living in a much more polarized world where,
Yeah.
you know, if you're not with me, you're against me.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you and I could have different views and still be able to sit down together.
You and I have had rows in the box. It doesn't stop us being friends, but nowadays you're quite right. If you're on one side of that, what about the middle? There should be a middle where you are, not you're wrong, I'm right. I hate that. I hate it.
When you're not writing, and I know we've discussed this, you write in 2-hour writing blocks. What are you reading? Are you reading something or listening to music? What are you doing to get away from the computer when you're not composing?
Well, I confess that I don't read a great deal when I'm writing. I do read a great deal when I go back to London or to Cambridge. I do read a lot and love reading. I've a tendency more to, I hope, watch what I call good television, watch something that will truly entertain me. And I can give you some examples. I've been loving, and I hope you've seen it. I've been loving Call My Agent, the French.
Oh, yes.
I think so. That sort of thing for me in the evening is a lovely getaway. But I would be bound to add that I have been overwhelmed by Ukraine, and I have been watching the news even more than I usually do. And the delight of seeing those very brave people fight to save their nation, and just the belief. I read more carefully the reports that are coming out of the Ministry of Defense, because they're not prejudiced. They're not on the Russian side, they're not on the Ukrainian side, they're giving you a report. So when they said, as they did this morning, that they now believe that the Russians can be pushed back to the border, and it may be impossible for them to mount this sort of operation again, certainly in the near future. And you add to that the Swedish and the Finnish joining NATO, that has had me as glued as any book.
Well, I must say, I mean, what is happening in Ukraine is dreadful. What the Russians are doing are dreadful. But in a way, it has given the British press the chance to have foreign press coverage. Because the one thing that I have noticed is the decline in foreign press coverage. British press used to have the best foreign press coverage historically, and over the years they have reduced it for cost reasons and so on. Now, tell me.
No, that's an interesting statement. We have the best foreign affairs coverage in the world, in your view?
Well, I mean, I'm talking of historically, you know, if you go back, yes, the New York Times was very good. But the trouble with the New York Times was that you started your story on the opening page and you found you were reading 5 pages of it, whereas the British press had the ability to synthesize. And they had, I mean, my hero was James Cameron, who was one of the great foreign reporters this country has produced.
Wonderful.
I mean, what has happened is foreign press coverage, I'm talking across the board, not just in the Times or the Guardian, has declined. But tell me, who is your greatest critic? Your wife, or who is it? Who's the one who reads and says, Jeffrey, this will not work?
Mary's useless because she's a scientist. As you know, she's chairman of the Science Museum, the first woman ever to chair a national museum or gallery. So she's useless. She's very good because she's well educated. She's very good on commas and full stops. But she writes, being a scientist, everything has to be so accurate and so careful. But yes, so she reads late editions. No, do you know, I'm going to tell you something that may shock even an old pro like you. They've recently done a survey on critics, writing critics. And I read it very carefully, and it said the public have stopped believing critics because they either favor a friend or whatever they do, or they hit someone. They now tell me, and it's all in this survey, it's the public who make the decision. So if you get a 5-star review from a member of the public saying, I can't put it down, or you get a critic saying, well, he's not really a literary writer, is he? It's the public who win. And that is one of the big changes. So I cruelly test myself in a very simple way. I look at what marks I get on Kindle, and I consider 4.5 wonderful. I'm very proud to tell you I've never been below 4. And I consider how many reviews you get important. It tells you what the public are thinking. And you can judge one book against another. You can judge yourself against other authors. And if you've had 15,000 reviews, the percentage stays constant. Because if 20 people hate you or 20 people love you, it makes no difference. So that is how I let the public decide.
Which is of your books, which is the one you like most?
Like most, the public have decided Cain and Abel by miles. I'm sentimental about Not a Penny More, Not a Penny Less. But the critics who you and I have been critical of say Paths of Glory. The story of Mallory wanting to conquer Everest is the best thing I've ever done. But I come back here. Let the public decide.
And which one was the most difficult?
Oh, I think undoubtedly Paths of Glory, because I was taking a real human being who wanted, when he was in 1924, think of Chariots of Fire, same year, he wanted to conquer this mountain called Everest. He was in a 3-piece suit with a rolled umbrella, very British. Didn't know where he was going. We know he got within 700 feet because his body was found at 700. But we don't know if he was going up or coming down. So to keep to the authentic truth of that great man, but give it an ending, that was a real challenge.
And what would you like to be remembered for?
As a storyteller. Yes, I'm very proud of my charity work and my auctioneering, but if you mean, is there one book I'd like to remember or be remembered for, I'd like to think I was a storyteller, and if I was talking to an Indian or I was in India, I would say I'd like to be remembered as a great cricketer.
And one final question, comparing your British public with your Indian public, what is the difference?
Well, one of the great moments in my life was the Jaipur Festival, when 8,500 Indians came to hear me speak, and I burst into tears. I was so shocked.
An Englishman crying in India, unheard of.
I burst into tears. So that was something I won't forget the rest of my life. I don't draw crowds like anywhere near that in any other country in the world. So India holds a very special place for me and always will. I was having a real go. My new man dealing with my gardener is a Sikh. And I was having a real go at him because he wasn't wearing a turban. And he said, well, that's what my father says. And we're moving on. But I think of Indians as being ambitious, hardworking, and straight. And I love dealing with them, always have done. And certainly they're playing a major role in Britain.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you very much. We shall, of course, probably meet when India play England at Old Trafford. And of course, we shall have different views on what the result will be. But on that note, thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Thank you very much. Lovely to see you again, and look forward to seeing you at Lord's or the Oval.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you, both of you, for such a wonderful and exciting discussion there. Really great. Both of you are such prolific authors, of course. And I've just noticed that Mahir has another book out. I mean, extraordinary, writes almost faster than we can read, called Dreaming the Impossible, The Battle to Create a Non-Racial Sports World. I was also just reminding everybody that one of the great themes of this, apart from the crossing borders, which we've covered nicely today, is the theme of ecology and the tree planting, which is part of the legacy of this festival. And this year, there are trees for tigers being planted in Sundarbans National Park in West Bengal, one for each of the speakers at the conference. Maybe next time one of you might be writing about the Sundarbans and West Bengal, and perhaps we could have our detective from the Met turning up and tracking tiger smuggling. Just a little suggestion from my part anyway for another book. Thank you both so much for contributing to this festival and keeping the legacy of Khushwant Singh alive. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival London. I'm sure many of you will have been here on earlier occasions when we've gathered in London in person to celebrate the life and work of Khushwant Singh. But even online, I think we can still have some real flavour of him and his work and his times, perhaps. And welcome to you all. So, the Literary Festival is to promote the legacy of Khushwant Singh, who was an author, a scholar, journalist and iconoclast, and we discuss the values he stood for and address his concerns. London is a place where we do this because he worked and studied here, and this shaped many of his ideas in his later life. He's interested in a closer ties between India and Pakistan, equal opportunities for women, and disseminating values of democracy, tolerance and compassion. And one of his major concerns was also ecology. And in the festival, we give all the speakers a certificate about planting a tree for them in the Sundarbans area of West Bengal. Now, this leads me on very nicely to today's talk between Professor Wendy Doniger and Professor Arshia Sutter, who are two old friends of mine, and I very much wished that we could welcome them in person to London today. In fact, the last time we all met was here in London, though we met on many continents before. Arshia Sutter, you probably know from her work on translations. She was Wendy's student in the 1980s. At the University of Chicago, where she did a PhD in South Asian languages and civilization. And her major work has been in the epics, particularly her translations of the Ramayana, though she's also translated the Katha and many other texts. And many of you will also know her work writing shorter pieces in magazines and newspapers and online in India. So she's an ideal person to be talking to Professor Wendy Doniger, who, in the manner of all eminent people, has given me a ridiculously short CV here, which doesn't do anything to encapsulate her great contribution to the world of South Asian studies and storytelling more widely. So many books with so many titles that I can hardly begin to mention them, although I remember being fascinated by them when I was an undergraduate many years ago, as she formerly taught in my home institution, SOAS, and wrote books with wonderful titles like Women, Androgynes and Other Mythical Beasts. And that's always my favourite, of course, of her books, but she's probably known to a new generation through her volumes on Hinduism, which came out lately and not without some controversy, which I think Khushwant Singh would have loved. But I think Khushwant Singh would really like to have met Wendy at the time she wrote this book, because he was always fond of beautiful young women, though I know we shouldn't say that these days. And Wendy's remarkable book, which is just coming out with Speaking Tiger in Delhi, is called An American Girl in India, Letters and Recollections of her time there as a student in 1963 to 4. And it's a fascinating document, as Arshia will, of course, be telling us, because, you know, this is about initial impressions of somebody who went on to hold one of the most prestigious positions in South Asian studies, and I can never pronounce this properly, Wendy, Mircea Eliade.
That's
it. Professor, Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago, now Emerita, and working on the history of religion. Now, this book, I think, will be of great interest to many, looking back at the historical document as well as Wendy's own personal life. So I'll hand it over to you, Arshia, and I look forward to joining you again for the discussion. Welcome both to a virtual London.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Rachel. And hello, Wendy.
Hello, Arshia.
Together again. How are you today? Together again. Rachel very correctly said that I was your student, but I do want to say that I'm still your student, and I will always be your student, and you will always be my teacher. But having said that, I also want to say that you are really one of my dearest friends, and people know you as a scholar. Many of us have the great good fortune of personally, and your warmth, your generosity, your sense of humor, your sense of loyalty, all of that is visible in this book when you were 22 years old. And I think that is fantastic, that even people who don't know you personally get to enjoy that part of you, the person behind all the degrees and the accolades and the big chairs and and the beautiful Indian shawls and the red lipstick. And, were you prepared for India in any way at 22?
It was a big shock to me when I got there. I was so sheltered. I hadn't been out of the States. I was brought up upper middle class parents and so on. So when I found these letters, which had been lost for 50 years, I started reading them. I was embarrassed, sometimes shocked by my naivete, by my attitudes toward things like race and gender, which we do so differently now. There were a lot of the letters which I found embarrassing. And when I presented the book to my wonderful publisher about this thing, I said, I want to cut this, I'm ashamed of this, we can't publish this, let's cut this. And he said, no, on the contrary, leave it in, but apologize for it. Write a preface saying, when I said X and Y, I was wrong, or I changed my mind, or that's what we thought then. So he made the book into a kind of a dialogue between my young, spoiled brat self that was I've never seen poor people before. I'd never seen the slums. I've never seen the slums of New York, and then I'm in Calcutta. So, so he said, leave that in, and then explain who you were and how you've changed. How you wouldn't say these things now. How you understand better what what you saw then. So the book came to me kind of a dialogue between my 81-year-old self and my 22-year-old self. And it became also an exercise in something that we're all doing, which is contemplating the stupidity of who we were 50 years ago before we got old, and apologizing for it and trying not to do it anymore. We do this with race, with gender, change our pronouns, we don't use certain words anymore. So this book is about that too. It's about who I was then and who I am now, and how I have to apologize for a lot. But at the same time, I loved India. I met wonderful people. I got them, I described them well. They came off the page. You can see that I wasn't an idiot.
No, you were not an idiot. You were a young 22-year-old girl in the 1960s. You know, you were
I was a spoiled brat. Yes.
That may be, but you were very much a creature of your time, you know.
Yes.
But when you were reading the letters, did you remember that girl, or was she just a stranger to you?
I remembered her. She had the same sense of humor. The letters are funny. She makes this.
Yeah.
I kept putting in footnotes explaining all the jokes. That I did have to do. A lot of Jewish jokes. I recognized her. So there are a lot of places where I said, I heard this wonderful story, and I tell it. And I tell it wrong. I tell the story of Saranyu and how she turns into a bear. But I got a lot of the details wrong. So I left it in. But then I wrote a whole book about her 10 years later. So there's a footnote that says, this story is not exactly right, but I got it right when I published the book, and that's the title of the book. So it's like seeing a bud that's going to turn into a flower someday. And you can see where you can see the love of India, the passion for Shiva, the passion for the landscape, the people, loving the people that I met and getting them down, quoting what they said, the characters, and so forth. So the essence is there, but there's just a lot of mistakes, a lot of naive generalizations. And then the other thing that I left things out then because I was writing for my parents. And you don't tell everything to your parents. So
you
I
don't.
didn't tell my parents.
So
then I wrote other footnotes in this conversation between the me and the her, where I said, well, for instance, I went to a goat sacrifice. Talk about how they took the goat and the priest got the goat by the horns and someone else grabbed him by the hind legs and they pulled him and then the scimitar came down and the head sprang away and the blood spurted. And at that point I said, well, at that point I needed a bit of air. So when I wrote to my parents, I needed a bit of air. What I didn't say was I passed out cold, fell on the ground, had to be carried out. My friends missed the whole rest of the ceremony. People had to fan me and give me water to drink and things like that. So in the 81-year-old part of the conversation, I put in the things that I censored, kind of parental guidance in reverse, things that I censored from parents. So that's the dialogue.
Yeah, you know, I think the book resonated with me for 100 reasons, but one of which, you know, possibly number 89 reason was that I was 22 when I left home. I came to America and I was writing letters to my parents, and God knows I was not putting everything in there. You know, it really is parental guidance. It is, you know, no, they don't need to know this. You know, they won't know how to handle it. Or like if you're sick or something, it's like, what's the point of telling them? You know, they're 10,000 miles away. They can't do anything.
I'm in wonderful. I kept saying I'm in wonderful health. I'm in wonderful. And then I said, now that I've gotten better, since I've gotten better, I realized I never told them that I was sick in the first place. So.
But you know, I mean, that honestly, that is one of the great pleasures of writing to your parents, because you don't say everything. You know, I'm sure it's true for parents. It's one of the great pleasures of writing to children. You don't tell them everything. You know, I would come home in the summer from America and say, oh, this happened. Oh, I didn't know, you know, whatever. But I've always been very curious about how you got to Shantiniketan, because typically you would imagine if a young American scholar, and you were already a budding scholar, well on your way to being the Wendy Doniger that we all admire. Why did you go to Shantiniketan and not to Calcutta University or, I don't know, JNU or something like that?
So when I was at Harvard, so I was hardly on my way. I finished my BA from Radcliffe, and I'd had 1 year of an MA. That's all I'd had. So I was really still a bud. And my professor was Daniel H. Ingalls, the great Sanskritist, who was a Southern gentleman from West Virginia, who really didn't like people of color, didn't like women, didn't like Jews. So I was a two-time loser in his scale of unacceptable people, being a Jew and a woman. But he liked me and he was nice to me. But he was very old-fashioned, and he was worried about a young girl alone in India. And so he thought, among other things, Shantiniketan was, of course, was Tagore's university. It was a great university. But at that time, it was also a kind of finishing school for upper-class Bengali girls. And he thought I would be safe there. I would be in the Burla hostel with all the other upper-class ladies, and we would, talk to each other, and there'd be no boys, and there'd be a chowkidar at the door to protect us. So he thought I would be safe. He was right. It was a very easy entry. It wasn't about to smack in the middle of the slums. So I started with a world a little like the world I was used to, Hamburg, and so forth and so on. And also I was interested in Bangla and culture. That was a great place to do it. I met the Tagore family right away. I met people. And then from there, when I got sea legs, kind of, I started branching out. I traveled. He was right. He may have been wrong about some things, but he was right that Shantiniketan was a lovely place, a gentle place,
and was it really like a 20th century Gurukula? Was it really like that? I mean, did you study under the trees? Did you grow your own food? Did you wash your own clothes?
Yes and no. We certainly did not. We had servants. We did not wash our own clothes. A lady came and took my clothes away and basically smashed them on rocks.
Yeah.
We were supposed to have all our classes under the trees, but I arrived in the monsoon. Excuse me. So the first time they said, well, the class in Bangla, we tried to get to the trees. It was a downpour. No one could. So we all met under the tree and raced back into the buildings looking for a place to hold a class. But everyone else had also raced back into the building because they were supposed to be meeting under the trees too. So we spent the whole hour looking for a place to meet. We never had a class. After a couple of days at this, the efficient American I went to them. I said, look here, why don't we just schedule the classes in the classrooms during the monsoon? They said, no, at Shantiniketan, the classes are held under the trees. And so basically, during the monsoon, I didn't have any classes at all. But afterwards, the classes, when it wasn't a monsoon, we met under the trees. We did indeed meet under the trees.
And how was it making friends? Was it difficult? Was your general extroverted nature just, made it simple?
I don't know why it was simple, but I right away met some wonderful people. What I found most interesting, I read the letters myself after 15 years. It was almost like reading somebody else's letter. They were lost for so long. Meeting the characters that I met Miss Judy Roy, we became friends. And then I met this wonderful Punjabi girl named Chansha, who is in many ways, I think, the heroine of the book. A high-spirited, chubby, fast-talking, sort of take no nonsense from anyone kind of a person who looked after me and took care of me and told wonderful stories. So she's in some ways the heroine. I met her right away. She immediately realized that I was helpless and stupid. She had to take care of me. She did everything for me. She yelled at my servant, they're not doing this right. She made them do it right. And she was great. She had wonderful stories. There's some very sad stories from her. She told me about what it was like to be a Hindu in Lahore when partition occurred and the killings. There's some rather dramatic and terrible stories in the letters that she told me, but she was also very funny. Her father was a Sikh, and Chantal said she got into a lot of trouble once because when she was in school, when she was 6 or 7 years old, they were learning English, and the teacher asked her what the word meat meant. And Chantal said it without ice. And she got her father into a lot of... She told me about her grandmother, who was very high caste, very, very fussy about pollution, and she kept the kitchen really clean. And to run in from outside and touch as many pots as she could and then run out again. And her grandmother then washed all the pots. So she's a great character in the letters. And Mistuni Roy, also very serious, a beautiful, talented young woman. So I met these people in Shanti Niketan. I met people on trains. People were just nice to me. There was a time I was on a train from Bolpur, which is where Shanti Niketan is, down to Calcutta. And along the way, everybody was eating their lunch, and I didn't have anything with me. And a man said, "Aren't you eating your lunch?" And I said, "Well, I had some, but I left them in Shanti Niketan." So when we next stopped, he ran out of the train, bought some food, it wasn't even bananas, and came back in and offered it to me. And he said, "Because you left your bananas in Shanti Niketan." And that was a wonderful, it was a complete stranger. So we sang songs on trains, we exchanged poems on trains, on buses too. I was on a bus once, and the bus stopped. No, it was a train. I was on a train and I had to wait for another train. And the train master invited us to his little honey and fed us some food, and it was time for the train to leave. And I said, "We better go." He said, "No, I'm the train master. They have to wait for us." He insisted that we have more tea, and every train is waiting. And finally we got on, and he started the train. And that's when I learned why it is that Indian trains were never on time. Things like that.
Never on time, yeah.
So things like that happened. I mean, it was wonderful.
Yeah. Well, trains, until fairly recently, this commensality in trains is just amazing, And honest, singing together, sharing food, telling stories, arranging marriages, all kinds of stuff. I mean, they become this little microcosm, and train journeys used to be really lots and lots of fun.
But it's nice that they took a foreigner in. It wasn't Indians with Indians. It was an American girl. It was nice. They let me into that commensality. That was what was nice.
Yeah. So many memories, Wendy, from that short year. Because what is your? I have my favorite stories in the book. What is your standout memory? What do you love to remember? What is the memory that gives you pleasure?
I think there are several. It's hard to choose one. But the first thing that comes to mind, and that in the letters, it wasn't even a memory, is what I was reminded of when I read the letters. What I noticed and cared about was I was carried away by the beauty of the landscape and the climate, by the stars at night, by the rain during the monsoon, walking in the countryside around Shanti Niketan, the way you saw a row of little boys on the top of a kind of a dike, just watching along, somebody playing a flute while he was herding cows, straight out of a miniature painting of Krishna. It was very mythological to me, the way the landscape came to life, and the way the architecture of the landscape, the way that the Hindu temples were like just sort of larger mounds than the other ones that you found in the countryside, and the way that the monsoon started, the way the monsoon ended. So there's a lot of the sky at night, the amazing sharpness of it, the way people were in the monsoon, the way they didn't even try to stay dry, but just ran around wet and then went inside and changed their clothes. So I was amazed by the climate of the landscape. The other thing which I wrote a lot about, which I do remember vividly, was that I learned a lot about one particular kind of Indian music, which was the charod, and in particular the playing of Ali Akbar Khan, whom I met in Calcutta and was sway with, and followed him around. He took me to his concerts. He helped me buy a charod, and he taught me to play it. So I spent a lot of time learning about it. I wrote in the letters a lot about how, what I loved about Indian music is that it didn't go bum, 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 the way European music I knew went, but it went the way it slurred between the notes. So it was my first real experience of that kind of Indian music. I was very scornful of Ravi Shankar and the sitar. I also made music. The two played together. But I didn't really like Ravi Shankar. And I loved the way he played. So there's a lot about that particular kind of music. Concert after concert. So that was near the end of my stay. That was in December. So it was after monsoon. But I loved it. That's very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. But you know, again, I mean, seeing that I've known you for just about, well, more than half my life, these two things are very much the Wendy that I know. This sort of very profound or very deep connection with nature, and you're always looking at the stars, and in this case the ocean, and how much music is in your life.
Show you where I am. Here we're talking about nature. So here I am.
Show everybody you are.
On the coast of Cape Cod. This is Cape Cod Bay. This is there. That's what I see from my window. There's a marsh, and beyond the marsh is the sea. So this is a happy place for me. I say lots of birds. I interrupted you. Well, go ahead.
No.
Go ahead.
No. I was wondering, since so much of you has stayed the same, from the 22-year-old girl to the soon-to-be 82-year-old woman, what is there something you learned in India, like about, I don't know, perhaps Hinduism, perhaps Shiva, perhaps people that still stands you in good stead today?
It's really a thing that carried through the years in which I was reading manuscripts and not being there, how people looked and moved and dressed. Women in Rajasthan carried big loads on their head, beautiful brass pots, the different sorts of ways that people wore their saris, the different sort of that Indian women have from me, the people I knew. Read about Gayatri or Shakuntala or Kunti or I had a person in mind. It wasn't just a character in a story. I thought of Miss Chanchal. I thought of the Indian women that I knew. I had a strong sense. I used to see how they put on their saris. They taught me how to put on my sari and so forth. So I had a strong sense of the actual human qualities of the characters that I read about in the stories. I was also appalled by caste and the injustices and the poverty and of the people who were not at Shantiniketan going to a finishing school. I saw aspects of life in India that I'd never seen in America, and it moved me very much. The sadness that used to be begged from. So sad, I didn't know what to do at first. I used to give money to beggars, and my Indian friends said, don't do it, and so forth. There was a woman in my room, Shantiniketan, and I would see her, I would hear from the distance. She would say, Mom, 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 and I'd hear the sound, and I knew that she was coming, and I would give her something, and she would go away. I was really deeply distressed by the treatment of the lower, the suffering of very poor people At first, when I talk about being naive, I talked about seeing people sleeping in the streets in Calcutta, and I knew it was a fantasy. I had a fantasy that they would wake up and then go home. And I saw them with their children, and I said, well, you know, the children at least are well, even people who have nothing, at least they give what they have to the children. The children are all well fed, and it wasn't true. And I learned after a while that I was whistling Dixie, as we say. So those things, on the one hand, the admiration of the beauty of the women, of the class women, and at the same time the suffering of other people. And all during my academic work, I was very, very sensitive to issues of caste. I wasn't a sociologist, I wasn't writing about it, but it comes into all the stories you read in Sanskrit. And I was always, when they talked about a beggar coming to the story, there's always stories about a beggar coming. I had an image, a very sharp image of that beggar. So those two extremes, the privilege of being among the upper classes in Bengal, which was so lovely, and at the same time the growing awareness of something I had never noticed in my own country. This haunted me, helped me in my work, brought it alive. Those are things I carried away with me. And also the landscape. When it said he went out into the jungle, I could imagine the jungle. I saw the landscape. So.
And now you're going to have a tree planted in your name in the Sundarbans. How beautiful is that? What a beautiful circle for you to be able to close, because the festival is going to do that. So, yeah.
I would love
so listen, I'm going to use a segue. You said you were very pleased to have Indian friends, and you know, to notice the way Indian women walked and how they carry loads on their heads. And you know, what did you look like, my dear, when you were 22? I think there's a lovely picture on the cover of your book, right? So do you have it at
There
hand?
are very few pictures. I don't know. I lost the letters and the photographs. I found the letters in 2018. I never found the photographs. I just have one or two short photographs in which I appear. So there is a picture on the cover of the book of me with my mother. I don't know. Can you show it in this program? I don't know whether you have it or not.
Yeah, I think you can do screen share.
Can I do screen share?
I suspect so. You don't have a copy of the book, do you?
I don't have a copy of the book,
Yeah,
but I have on my computer a copy of the cover. So I want.
Okay, wait. We've just got a message saying Ashwini will show it to us. So yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe he'll do that, and you can tell us also what your mother felt about coming to India and how she found you in India. Was it the same Wendy of Great Neck, or was this another little girl? Yeah.
It was wonderful having, as I said, I was very close to my parents and I was homesick for them. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Donagers of Great Neck about my mother and my father. And I wrote these letters to them. And so when my parents were going to come and visit me in India, that's how close I was. I mean, how many people do you know who have their parents come along on a research trip? So, so my parents were supposed to come at the last minute. My father couldn't come. There was a crisis. He was a publisher, and there was a crisis in his publishing company. And my mother came. And as you would have known it from the other book, my mother was an extremely domineering, loud, wonderful personality who sort of took over everything and bossed me around a whole lot. Where in India, she let me boss her around. It was wonderful. I was in charge, and she was very well behaved for the most part. She was much braver than I was when we went to Varanasi. There was a man with a python. He said to me, would you like to hold the python? I thought, no, I don't want to hold that damn python. My mother said, yes, please. And one of the photographs in the book is of my mother cheerfully holding the python. And when we were in Madras, we went up into the hills to see a wonderful Kathakali performance of the Mahabharata. There's a picture of that in the book too. And it was in a little tiny village, and they offered us food. And I had been sick a lot in India, and I ate sort of like hard-boiled eggs and bananas was what I was mostly eating all the time. And they brought us these trays full of things. You couldn't even tell what it was. God knows what it was, snake gizzards or something like that. And they gave it to both of us, and I looked at my mother and I said, and she smiled and she ate it and she ate it and she ate it, and she didn't even have the good grace to get sick afterwards. She was just fine. So she had a lot of fun. She was good natured about the difficulties, and when much later, in 1991, when she was dying and we were by her bedside, she turned to me and she said, the most wonderful thing that ever happened to me in my whole life was the trip to visit you in India. She said it was the point of her life. I was very moved by that. She and I didn't always get on that well, but we got on really well in India. And then she said that at the end. So that was
I'm really sorry that the parents' book, The Donegals of Great Neck, is not going to be published in India. Obviously, I mean, it doesn't have the same kind of context, but it is the companion book. It really, really is the companion book to your memoir. So we're going to see the book cover right now, but I want to keep talking. I want to talk to you about one very specific thing.
Let's see the cover, then we'll keep talking. Okay.
Yeah.
There it is. The cover. There I am. It's in Mahabalipuram. I'm sitting on the Nandi with my hands on his hump, and there's my mother leaning on it behind me. You can see we have the same basic shape of face. We have the same reddish hair. There we are. It's a wonderful cover. Ravi Singh did a wonderful job. It's clever how they put the writing in the only meaningless parts of the photograph. It's really neat. Anyway, so that's one of a few pictures that I still had from my visit to India. That's who I was, and that's who she was. Okay, so what did you want to ask me?
So here's my Great Neck question. What did they put in the water? Because there is another great woman, Sanskritist from Great Neck, Long Island,
Yeah, Barbara Stoller Miller.
Barbara Stoller Miller, yeah.
She was a professor of Sanskrit at Columbia, at Barnard. We were in the same class in Great Neck High School, and we were not friends. We moved in different factions. I was what would have been a hippie, except it was the wrong years for it. What we called it then was a bohemian. I hung out in Greenwich Village with artists and gay people, which was very risque in those days, and so forth and so forth. And she wore cashmere sweater sets, very neat. And I wore stuff like this even then. I was already, dressing like this. So we didn't get along at all. We only got along years later when we were both grown-up lady professors. Something about Great Neck, I don't know, to prove. At one time, she and I were the only, it was before Rosanne Rocher came to America, we were the only lady professors of Sanskrit in America. We were the same graduating class at Great Neck High School.
Amazing. Really, really amazing. But let us now talk about your current work, right? Because you have retired, so they tell me. I've yet to believe it. I know that you're not teaching anymore, but you're writing as much as ever. You're reading as much as ever. You're helping your students as much as ever, including me. You know that I never publish anything without your red pencil going through it several times.
Yes, but there's a big piece of you in my new book too, so it's
it trades. So and Ravi Singh is exclusively your publisher in India. God bless him for that.
Ravi Singh is just so wonderful. Yeah. Yes. So I think it was Rachel Dwyer, with whom we're going to talk to again, who once told me that in India, in some circles, he's known as ravishing, which you get by putting H and Singh a little bit forward and so forth. But, not only has he been very brave about publishing books of mine that have made some people cross, but he's also been very inventive. He's my editor. He goes through things and he says, why don't you say this? And why don't you change this? And why don't you tell me more about that? And in this last book, of course, he made a tremendous difference. He said, let's have the other half of the conversation. So So he's
The
published
editor. He's,
almost all of my books in the last 10, 12 years, except the one which I thought was so localized that only New York Jews would buy it, basically. I didn't think it would go in Calcutta. So, but all the others, and the ones I'm doing now also.
Yeah, no, Ravi's a great editor. He edited my Ramayana, and you know, I'm forever grateful.
He's a wonderful editor.
Yeah. He's also a great publisher. Let us say that, or let us name the publishing house, since everybody doesn't know who Ravi Singh is.
Speaking Tiger. It's Speaking Tiger.
Speaking Tiger Books. And last year, I believe you published a book on horses, which is your other great passion in life. Is it not?
It was also one of the privileges of getting old. There are problems involved, but one of the privileges that you can write from the heart. You're not writing to impress. I am a great scholar. Look what I know. You do that when you're little, but when you're grown up, you say, this is what I've found out about life that matters to me. And you write a different kind of a book. The Donegals of Great Neck was certainly, in a way, an apology to my mother, because as I said, we fought a lot. And the horse book was put together everything I'd always loved about horses in my private life and how I'd always noticed horses in literature. Even in the horse book, I had just discovered the letters from India when I published the horse book. There's one passage describing a horse painted on the side of a house in the Bengal countryside, which I described in my letters, and I described it very well. I said it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Just painted on the side of a mud hut that didn't have plumbing or anything, just a very simple house. So even the letters from India began to get into the horse book a little bit by having that one horse, but it's also the horses in the Rig Veda. It's also a scholarly book, horses in the Mahabharata and all of that. So it's a combination of my personal experience of horses with Ellen Betjeman, who grew up in India because her father was the commander-in-chief in India. There's a story there too, of course, a different story. So it's called Winged Stallions and Wicked Mares, Horses in Indian Myth and Literature. And that's the last book for this one. It's not the last book. Ravi then invented a book of dreams, cutting together several pieces about dreams that I'd written in the past, and I added another one, and there's a whole new book, which is really his book as much as my book, about the mythology of getting inside of other people's dreams, getting inside the mind of God. It's a very theological and philosophical book, really, for me. Anyway.
And very much rooted in the Yoga Vasishtha and your book, Dreams, Illusions, and Other Realities. I mean, Rachel was talking about in your introduction how you have the best titles. This is my favorite title of all your books. Dreams, Illusions, and Other Realities, and much of the Ravi Singh Dreams book, I think, comes out of there. But you are still doing massive scholarly work. You have a translation of the Mahabharata, not the Mahabharata, but the last 5 books of the Mahabharata coming out next month, right?
That's right. That's right. It's coming out in America, maybe Oxford next month, and it's coming out in India in August, I think. It's called After the War, the Last Books of the Mahabharata. And it's a translation of the last books of the Mahabharata, but it's also an introduction and discussion because, again, just as I think the letters book has something to say about our quandary now, about our shameful past as a planet, so too, in the Mahabharata, the last books are the heroes coming to terms with their shameful past, looking back upon the war and all the terrible things they did, the people they killed that they shouldn't have killed, the whole war which shouldn't have happened. And in particular, it's about the word manyu, which is a wonderful Sanskrit word for which there's no single English equivalent, which means anger, pride, righteous anger, vengeance. How dare you do that to me? Now that you've done that to me, because I am an aristocrat, I will do something to you. All of that is in manyu. And it's what kept the Mahabharata battle going on for so many years, because they did this to Draupadi, so we'll just do this to you. Because they did the night raid, we'll do this to you, and so forth and so on. And so in the last books, they come to terms with this. They go to heaven, they find their enemies in heaven, And they say, I don't want to be in heaven if he's there. So the battle threatens to go on even in heaven until they realize they never should have been fighting with these people in the first place. So it's really an extraordinary book, the last quarter of the Mahabharata. And it's quite relevant, I think, to other things that we're thinking about today, and Ukraine and other places on the planet and so forth. So that was a lot of fun to rethink. I've been working on it for years, but I finally put it together in this last year.
It's amazing how the Mahabharata changes after the war. I mean, it becomes like a different genre almost of writing really and thinking, and it's meaningful, to read it, as you said, in our times.
It forms a piece. I mean, I translated partly because there are fairly good translations of the first few books of the Mahabharata. They were done at Chicago some years ago, and there are pretty good translations with the clay Sanskrit series of some of the middle books, but no one has ever really properly translated the last books. The P.C. Roy translation, of course, is always there. When John Smith did his translation, he didn't do hardly any of it. He left out most of the last books. So there's a real academic need for an accurate translation, but I think there's also a need for people who didn't know they were interested in the Mahabharata to read about what we can learn from those books. So that's coming out also from Robert Singh.
Yep. I think many of us need a moral re-examination, and this is a great prompt at a very, very, very difficult time in our lives. And so I'm going to invite Rachel to join us, Wendy, since she is a friend of both of ours, and she too was once a little girl or a young woman writing letters home from India, perhaps. Did you, Rachel? Did you write letters home from India?
I did, but perhaps not as often. I was wondering, I mean, Wendy was more in one place, whereas I was moving around, remembering the old post restaurant and going to see if, you had any letters from home. But I mean, I'd grown up with a father who was in the Navy, so I was kind of used to living relationships through letters from a very early age. I just look back and I think, what did my parents think they were doing? I was a teenager and just went off to India on my own with a backpack and hardly any money.
Wow. So you were even younger than I was. How old were you?
19.
19, wow. Well, you beat me by 3
But
years.
I mean, I know I've already reached that age. Our time was the golden age, nostalgia, this and that. But there's something about writing those letters, because I know I used to sit down every Sunday evening and write 3 pages, both sides, to my parents, where I would tell them what had happened in the week, kind of, sort of, right? And they did the same thing. And the sort of the leisure with which you wrote letters, and you came back to them. And email has such a sort of instant quality to it that I think we process our own experiences so differently in email rather than we do in letters. But Rachel, I'm sure you have questions for Wendy too. I've been doing all the interlocuting. Would you like to interloculate for a little while?
I mean, it was so fabulous to hear you. I mean, I'm very worried. I'm not. I mean, I'm very British, and if I say something's nice, that means wow, it was amazing and wonderful. And you were saying everything was wonderful, and I mean,
understatement. Yes, understatement has never been one of my problems.
Never.
But the other thing about the letters that I wrote, they were very long. Some of them are 12 single-spaced pages. I meant them as a way of keeping in touch with the 2 people I love best, but they were also my field notes. I also was traveling, Rachel, and I afraid I was going to lose things. So I wrote out everything and I sent it home so I'd have it safe. So that when I got back, a lot of it is about Sanskrit texts I was translating. So I was also sort of writing to myself in some ways. To keep in touch with them. So it was not like a diary, because I didn't put those into it. Anyway, go ahead, Rachel.
No, I mean, and I think that's fascinating, and that idea of, being, I mean, my parents would have probably been surprised if I'd written anything very personal to them at any point, I remember
you were British. What could you do? You were British.
And one of my friends went on an American field trip, but I mean, on English speaking union, and she was 18, I think, and she was away for a year. And she once rang home, and her father said, "Are you unwell?" And she said, "No." And he said, "Well, no need to call," and put the phone down on her. But
I left things out. The other thing I left out, I remember, was at Durga Puja. They gave us a lovely little milkshake to drink. And I had it was delicious, and I've always been greedy. I said, "Can I have another?" And everybody laughed, and I should have realized there was a reason, so I had another. And of course, it was pot. It was liquid marijuana. So I wasn't much of a drinker, and I never did drugs. I wasn't that kind of a teenager. I tell you, I was a sheltered girl. So I got stoned out of my mind, and so my notes on Durga Puja are very, very slight. They're the shortest part of the book, in a way. And I did not tell my parents about that. That's just what I keep doing. But I remembered it vividly. I was with Ed Dimmock from the University of Chicago, and we drove around the Maidan in an open Jeep. He was stoned too. Someone else was driving. There was a driver. And as we went around the Maidan, it was dark, was unlit in those days at least. He thought we were in Chicago and it was Lake Michigan, and he wanted to go and swim in it. We had to keep Professor Dimmock from jumping out of the Jeep to go swimming in it. Those things did not happen.
But I wonder about this, also, both Rachel and Wendy, that, when we write these letters that are somehow to ourselves, right?
Yes.
It's a really odd combination of mythologizing our lives and telling the truth.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sort of sense of you're creating a self, that perhaps your older self will find and read, or your parents will say, "Oh, my darling daughter, I'm so proud of you," when actually you're the devil, But it's a lovely, it's a lovely tension. It's a really beautiful negotiation.
Because I was writing to, but you're absolutely right, and both because I was writing to them and because I was trying to cheer myself up when I was terribly homesick, I pretended to like everything more than I did, and I was ashamed that I wasn't able to like everything in India. I lied to myself. I didn't really mind this. So there's that big lie going on through all the letters. I very occasionally say how nice it was to get to a place where I had a clean bed. And only then did you know that I'd been sleeping under conditions that had bothered me because of their bad quality and I hadn't slept well and so forth. So you are trying to create a mythologized, brave traveler. Everything, the more obstacles I encounter, the more fun I have and all of that. Whereas you're really frightened part of the time and disappointed part of the time and sick part of the time. And it creeps into the letters sometimes. In a negative way, I say, "I'm not homesick anymore." I say, "Oh yeah, well, I guess I must have been homesick," or something like that. Because you are creating a self for your own self to be proud of later on.
That's the person in India we call your good self, Wendy. That is your good self.
You leave out the things that you
Yeah.
And I was also thinking, it must have been very different. I mean, obviously, going in the 60s and I went in the 80s, different times, of course. But also when you were going with a Brit, you were suddenly facing a whole bit of British history that you'd done a bit of at school, but didn't really know. And suddenly it was like, oh my God, here it is. And, wasn't expecting to see you here or you here. And, I don't know if it's an American, if it felt different.
I was grateful at first for the things that the British had done. I was glad that the signs were in English, things like that. Oh, thank God for that. Now I know where I am and stuff like that. But I'd also seen, even when I was in England, it was interesting. The very first letter is from London before I ever got on the plane to Calcutta. And I had interviewed Jane Drew and her husband, who had been the architects of Chandigarh, the Le Corbusier designed city. And I asked them, even then, I said, "What do you do when you get sick in India?" It's interesting that even then I was worried that I was going to get sick, as indeed I did. And Jane Drew said, "Well, we go to England." And I said, well, what do the Indians do when they get sick in England? And she said, they go to England. So there I am with this colonial bullshit in my head, and I get on the plane and I land in India. So I was aware of the British, of India, and so forth. And Tagore had a lot to do with the English-speaking world. So I was in a borderland in a way in the beginning, and I got deeper and deeper into India itself as I moved on. But I did go as an American rather than as an English woman, and it made a big difference. The horse book that Arsha referred to, which has a lot in it about Penelope Betjeman, much later, well, not that much later, actually, in 1965, 2 years after I got back from India, I moved to England for 10 years, and I spent those 10 years riding horses with Penelope Betjeman. And that's when I really got to know British India. And she told me what it was like growing up in Government House and so forth. So I was not aware of Indian history. I've never read the story. I always liked to read the texts. So I wasn't really that much aware of the English part of Indian history when I got there. And I gradually discovered it more and more. And I learned about partition largely from Chanchal and hearing her horror stories of what it was like to be during the terrible violence of it. So I began to learn history when I got there. And it was an important lesson.
But it was ancient India that, I didn't really realise till I looked at the book about, that you'd done Bengali, and I had no idea actually. And because I always think of you as being very much, interested in ancient India and the Sanskrit.
Well, when I went there, as I said, until I went to that goat sacrifice, I had thought that I actually might be an anthropologist. I wasn't sure that I was only going to do Sanskrit, and I wanted to learn Bangla because I liked what I knew of Bengali literature. And I stayed with Ed Dimmock, who was the great scholar of Bangla in America. In fact, one of the best stories in the book, I love this story, is about Ed Dimmock. So he had 5 children, and he took them with him when he went, and a wife, and he took them all with him when he went to India. So they had this long flight. In those days, it took a long time to get from Chicago, which is where it was. You had to stop in London and in Beirut and all these other damn places. And finally, he arrived in Calcutta at Swinhoe Street, Ballygunge, in the middle of the night. The 5 children had vomited on themselves and peed on themselves and pooped on themselves. And they were exhausted and they were crying. It was the middle of the night, and the house was locked. So he rang and shouted and banged, and finally the chowkidar got out of bed and came and started opening the house. And Ed was so furious, he yelled at the chowkidar in Bangla. He told him what he thought of him and his mother and his sister and his relationship to his sister, and went on and on and on with this fluent Bengali curses. Finally, he ran out of breath, and he was immediately sorry because he knew it wasn't the chowkidar's fault. And anyway, he was a very nice man, and he was a Unitarian minister. So before he could apologize, he was getting ready to apologize, the chowkidar said, "Shai, bhalo Bangla bhasha bolte paren." Sir, how well you speak Bangla.
Okay, I'm going to have to end this now. Yeah, I'm going to have to end this now. We have literally a minute, but how appropriate, Rachel, that you should be with us this evening, and how very, very appropriate that we end with a Wendy story, because she's one of the great storytellers of the world, and God knows she has a story for every occasion. So in Bangla,
India was the greatest story of them all. India was the great story.
Well, thank you both very, very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Arsha. Thank you, Kushwant Singh.
Did you ever meet him, Wendy?
I never did. But I know of him through Arsha. I know
Who I knew when I was a little girl, and one of the things I loved best about him is he never treated me like a little girl. He spoke to me as if I was an adult. I was 11. And I sort of got used to that. Yeah.
That's a good man.
Excellent. So we look forward to the book's publication shortly from Speaking Tiger. Wonderful.
Thank you both, and Thank you.
Hello and welcome to a very special session in the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival. Perhaps today I really need to say hello, namaste, sat sri akal and salam alaikum, because we're bringing together people from around the world who are brought together by the love of poetry, especially poetry in Urdu, a language that is shared between India and Pakistan, a language which has one of the great literary traditions. And today we're talking about perhaps its leading light, Ghalib, the great poet who we all know as the poet of Delhi. Today, I think it's something rather special in Khushwant Singh's, as we remember Khushwant Singh, because not only, of course, did he love Urdu poetry very much, but also because we are crossing borders. And this is a theme of today's session. We are looking at two people who have worked across India, Pakistan, and we also have an American connection too. So let me introduce today's speakers. Raza Mir, who is introducing the session today, grew up in Hyderabad, India, and teaches in the USA. I believe he's in New Jersey right now, but he writes books on Urdu poetry. He's written The Taste of Words, an introduction to Urdu poetry, and is co-author of Anthems of Resistance. And he's also written a novel, which I've bought for a friend, though not yet read myself, called Murder at the Mushaira. And we hope there won't be a murder this afternoon as we discuss this topic. He is going to be talking to Anjum Altaf, who is based in Lahore, where he was Professor of Economics and Dean of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at, I see it called Lahore University of Management Sciences, but more familiar to us all, of course, as LUMS, Lahore. So wonderful to have this here. He is co-author of Thinking with Ghalib, and his co-author is in India, in a place that Khushwant Singh himself would have loved, in the Kumaon Hills. And he's Amit Basole. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. I don't know the name Basole, but Amit is easy for me, who heads the Centre for Sustainable Employment at the Azim Premji University, working on what is called jobless growth in India. And he's also Associate Professor of Economics in the School of Arts and Sciences at the university. Amit is a double doctor, I gather, with a PhD in economics from the University of Massachusetts, as well from a PhD in neuroscience from Duke University. So we're coming together with people who are not only geographically differently located, but in different disciplines. But whatever the disciplines they work in, what really brings them together is love of this great poet of Delhi, poet of the world. Looking forward to hearing from you all. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that extremely generous and should I say, evocative introduction. I am really excited to be speaking to Amit and Anjum. I came across their book project well before it was published, and I have been extremely fascinated by it. So without further ado, I want to lead off by asking first Anjum and then Amit that would you just briefly tell us a little bit about how you connect your own personal self to Ghalib and how this particular book this collaboration came about. So Anjum first.
Sure, Raza. That's fairly easy. As has been mentioned, Khushwant Singh loved Ghalib, and I think that must have been so because they shared so many traits, like being irreverent, contrarian, challenging orthodoxy, inciting people to think for themselves, especially about faith and belief, and doing everything in a very playful and humorous way. So I think anybody who is fascinated by thinking connects with Ghalib very easily. Myself and Amit also, because we are economists, we want our students to be thinking about all the time about what they're working on, what they're researching. This really, for me, didn't start as a project that had anything really to do with literary analysis or Ghalib studies or anything of that sort. It was an initiative to get people to think. And for that, as economists, we found Ghalib to be the optimal resource for doing that. So we were using Ghalib to do the kinds of things that Khushwant Singh does in his book, get people to think about faith and belief. So that's how it started for me, and both independently of each other, Amit and I were, kind of exploring Ghalib from different angles. And thanks to the internet, we got together. And from that shared interest, this emerged, which ultimately turned into a book.
Thank you, Anjum. And Amit, would you add a little bit to this narrative?
Yeah, sure. So thank you very much, Raza. It's a pleasure to be talking with you in particular about this book, and really appreciate the support that you've given from the beginning. So just a little bit about the personal journey first. I think I first encountered Ghalib when I was maybe in my early 20s. I was doing my master's, and in my laboratory at the time, there was a senior of mine from Kashmir who was a big fan of Ghalib, and he introduced me to Ghalib at the time. And I started reading a little bit, and I think, as with most people, it immediately resonated at a very personal level. At the time, I was not thinking about a lot of the stuff that made its way into the book, which is a very different thing that we will talk about. But just at a level of the issues that he was talking about and the way he was talking about it really spoke to me at that time. And then a few years later, I chanced on Francis Pritchard's wonderful website that I think many of our viewers may also know, Desert Full of Roses, which really offers excellent commentary on all of Ghalib's Urdu verses. And then as it turned, as Anjum mentioned, he and I were, at that time, blogs were new. The new thing in 2007-8, around that time. So both of us were blogging about Ghalib in different ways, and we encountered each other, actually, as it turns out, on the Columbia University Urdu list, which is also run by Francis Pritchard. And we found each other there, just by chance. And then we started this sort of online collaboration. We still haven't met ever in person. So, borders being what they are, that just still hasn't happened. But yeah, anyway, so.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful to acknowledge the role played by Francis Pritchard in bringing this book about. That is wonderful. And, हुई मुद्दत के गालिब मर गया पर याद आता है वो हर एक बात पर कहना कि यूं होता तो क्या होता. तो सही बात है कि Ghalib really connects us in multiple ways what I personally found fascinating about Ghalib is, first of all, Ghalib had a long life and a long career. And in that life and career, we are fortunate to have encountered what I may refer to as a witness to history. Ghalib was born in Mughal India, and by the time he died, Mughal India had turned into colonial India, and the cataclysmic events of the 1857 Ghadar, he was a witness to. And so I think that through his personality, we can really chart out history too. And the other thing is that, it bears mentioning that he is the greatest Urdu stalwart. And so the turns of phrase that he created, a very philosophically minded person, have become standard tropes in Urdu language. So to that extent, I think you did a wonderful job of putting it together. Could you just talk to me about how you chose the particular structure of that book, which is a very unique way to deal with Ghalib?
Yeah, so from the beginning, I think the idea was to just stick with a sher and not take the ghazal approach, and just sort of talk about those two lines and what they bring to mind. Because a lot of what we in daily life do with Ghalib, as you are also familiar, it's those two lines that come. We hardly ever recite a ghazal. As you just did, you recited a sher. Which just happens to capture whatever is being discussed at the time. So we wanted to stay with that mood and say, ki is baat pe ye yaad aaya. Ki, if Anjum were here, I think one of his favorite one is, every time he hears some politicians in Pakistan, or for that matter in India, say something, the words that come to mind are, khushi se mar na jate jo etbar hota. So there are these sort of appropriate things that come to mind. So we thought we'll stick with that and say, okay, we'll just talk about this couplet and what brings to mind, what comes to mind when you see this couplet. The thing that is different is that we are not really doing a lot of, as Anjum said, literary interpretation. We have a translation which is mostly either taken from Pritchett or modified a little bit. And then most of the entry, so to speak, for a particular sher is just us broadening its applicability to the social universe. And of course, I think many people might not like that. I think there's strong opinions on how much to read into this kind of poetry, and I'm sure there'll be people who say, well, you shouldn't use this verse to talk about this thing or whatever. So we've thrown that caution to the wind, and it helps that neither of us is coming from the world of literary analysis or Ghalib studies or anything like that. So we took liberties with it, and I guess some people may like it and some might not.
Sure. And I think that what you just mentioned speaks very much to the structure of the ghazal. So if I may just take a minute to talk about, for example, the particular ghazal that you, Khushi Se Mar Na Jate Wali. The ghazal is a very unique, in the larger poetic context, a very unique form of poetry where the couplets in and of themselves are required to have a thematic coherence, but the ghazal itself does not require that. So for one of Ghalib's most celebrated ghazals is the one that Amit mentioned. And if we may just look at it together, ke ye na thi hamari qismat ke wisal yaar hota, agar aur jeete rehte yahi intezar hota. This is the matla. The first two lines rhyme. And now, very clearly, he has articulated a position. It was not my fate to have a union with my beloved. And now that I am at my deathbed, perhaps, had I lived more, it would be the same, waiting. The sher moves on, the one that Amit partially quoted, ke tere waade par jiye hum. Look at the beauty of this sher. Tere waade par jiye hum, to ye jaan jhoot jana. Jaan is no. That I lived despite your promise, understand it to be untrue. And the first line of the ghazal sets up a mystery, which then, of course, the second line solves. तेरे वादे पर जिए हम तो ये जान झूठ जाना कि खुशी से मर न जाते अगर एतबार होता. That had I really trusted you, I would have died of happiness. So yeah, the dripping irony of this share is such, and so each share in and of itself produces a world. कि कहूँ किससे मैं के क्या है, शबे गम बुरी बला है, मुझे क्या बुरा था मरना अगर एक बार होता. No, it would have been okay to die, but I die every day. I mean, the sheer pathos, the poignancy is there. And now the irony is left behind. The irony of the earlier share is left behind. And then, of course, as everybody knows, but it bears repeating, the Maqta of the Ghazal is one where the poet signs his name with a flourish. And in this case, Ghalib is a person who is not above, should I say, praising himself, and also in some ways putting himself down. And both of them come out in the Maqta of this ghazal, which says, "Ye masail tasawwuf, ye tera bayan ghalib." Look at these matters, these metaphysical matters. Tasawwuf is really from the word Sufi, but metaphysical. You speak so metaphysically, you speak so philosophically, and you speak so eloquently. Ye tera bayan ghalib. तुझे हम वली समझते. We would have thought of you a saint. And then he puts himself down. तुझे हम वली समझते जो न बादखार होता. Had you not been a drinker. So Ghalib, as we have often mentioned, was really not only proud of the fact that he drank, and in this way he connects to Khushwant Sahab a lot, because Khushwant Sahab loved his drink. He didn't drink a lot, but he always mentioned his whiskey all the time. So we connected. कि तुझे हम वली समझते जो न बादखार होता. Look, all you people, when you see my metaphysics, don't think of me as this sort of saintly creature. I really love the, should I say, the pleasures that this world gives me. So I find that extraordinary. And I think that your choice of using one couplet and then expanding upon it really, really works. So to get back to the book then, Amit, how did you met this person, Anjum, on the list, and at some point in time, I guess you took your conversations offline. How did this book eventually take shape? Could you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, but we never really went offline. It's always been online in different forms. So we did a series of blog posts together about 12, 13 years ago. In fact, longer now, almost 14 years ago. And then that was it, really. We selected these couplets. There were about 30 couplets that we blogged about. We talked about them all online, email, and so forth. And it was many years later. And then we did our own things. I moved back to India. I started work at Azim Premji. Anjum was in Lahore for a bit. He went to Habib University in Karachi for a bit, came back to Lahore, retired. All of these things happened. And then during the pandemic, out of nowhere, I got an email from him saying, there's a lot of time now. All of us are sitting here, during lockdowns. Should we do something about these things that we've written? And, we've talked about having a book, but we never did it. So I said, sure. And that was the first time that, we seriously discussed the book. And he managed to find a publisher in Lahore, got it in manuscript form. I spoke to him for the first time only during the pandemic. I had never heard his voice, in all of these years that we had known each other. We had not spoken to each other. We did a video call. I saw him face to face, so to speak, only a couple of years ago. So the pandemic has really been largely responsible for bringing the book about and connecting us, much more closely than we were before. As it turns out, I had actually visited Lahore once with great difficulty for 4 or 5 days, but I didn't meet him at the time, and he's been to Bangalore, but we have never met. So the book, during the pandemic, it just so happened that there was enough time to make it into one and look for publishers and so forth.
Great. And in terms of 30 couplets from a vast corpus of work, gives you a lot of latitude to choose. Is there a particular criterion you used for the choice, or did you sample it in particular ways?
Right. Anjum sir, he's come back. Raza sir was just asked about the selection of the couplets. So since I have been holding the conversation, maybe you would like to come in and talk a little bit about the choice of couplets and why we chose the ones that are there.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. I just wanted to add to that, it's really what we mentioned was that the decision to go the couplet route rather than the ghazal route really worked out very well for you. So in this context, because the work is very big, how did you end up choosing your 30 ash'ar?
Sure. I think for the first part, we made a very conscious decision to go with the couplet rather than with the ghazal, because we were interested in the meaning, and because as you know, every couplet in a ghazal means something, so thematic connectivity in that sense. So that was not the good unit of analysis for us. A lot more sense. And what we were trying to do to invite thinking, we selected the couplets that we thought were the most meaning intensive, that were layered and complex, and spoke to the. So for us, that was, I think, one of the primary criterion, that it would be, very meaning intensive, and Amit can more to that, because most of them were his selection, and I don't think that we were thinking very consciously at that time that they would end up in a collection. It happened to work out that way, that it turned out in hindsight to be a good selection.
Ji bilkul. I think that since Amit, you chose, maybe you could just say a little more, and then we'll spend some time quoting a little bit of Ghalib too.
Yeah. So I think as Anjum said, a lot of it was driven by this desire to think with Ghalib, and so I at least was often looking for verses that were off the beaten track too, right? So I remember sort of consciously going through the divan and saying, okay, what haven't I seen before? People sing certain ghazals, people quote certain ghazals, but there are so many more, as you said, Raza. It's a large collection. And then once in a while, a verse just jumps out at you, and the favorite one of mine for this purpose, it's not a general favorite verse, but just for how it jumps out at you, is actually in the book towards the end, and that is Wafadari basharte ustuwari asle iman hai. Mare but khane mein to kaabe mein gaado Brahman ko. I had to read it many times to make sure I was actually reading what I thought I was reading, because I'd never heard this verse before, and it was such a strong image. And first of all, just seeing Ghalib use the word Brahman was new for me, because we don't hear about these verses so often. So what is he talking about? Why is this Brahman dying in the temple, and why is he being buried in the, mare putkhane mein to kaabe mein gaado Brahman ko? That really grabs you by the throat. So some of these couplets, I think they really invite you to wrestle with what he's saying, and he's deliberately twisting upending the symbolism. He's doing all of this sort of, what in the Kabir context you might call ulat bani. Kaabe mein ja bajayenge naku, sab to banda hai der mein haram. So just mashing things up and mixing them up and so forth. So part of these verses are really like that, where you want to choose a verse to make a particular point. And the very first verse with the book, which the book opens with, kya farz hai ki sabko mile ek sa jawab. Again, it's a conscious choice to say, okay, how do we bring in the reader to think about things, you know. And what better way to start than to quote Ghalib in saying, you know, let us ask these questions. It's not necessary that all of us will get the same answers, right? So each one has its own discovery. Yeah.
Very nice. And I think that we could spend, I mean, there are various themes that emerge from what you said. For example, the trope of the Brahman is used very well by Ghalib and is used, if I may say so, very lovingly, right? For example, in another place he says कि देखिए पाते हैं उस शाख बुतों से क्या फैज, एक ब्राह्मण ने कहा है कि ये साल अच्छा है. So the Brahman here functions as a soothsayer. You know, I like to use this as a New Year's greeting to my friends. Let us see what lovers get from idols. Lovers on one side, idols on another side. Now, I don't want to interpret this, and you people, both of you, have done an excellent job of leaving interpretive latitude to your readers in the speech. But the Brahman comes here almost as a guarantor, that something in the future will work very well. In another place, Ghalib says, "Nahi hai subbo zunnar ke phande mein gir aayi, wafadari mein shaykho barhaman ki azmaish hai." Subba is the, you know, is the tasbih, the rosary beads that the Muslims use in their prayer. And Zunnar is the thread that the Brahman wears. So both of them are markers of faith. And he says, neither of them really have any, you know, hold. What really has hold, perhaps, is this business of wafadari, staying constant. And wafadari mein Shaykh or Brahman ki azmaish hai. They are both going to be tested. And this connects so beautifully with the verse that you mentioned. Ki wafadari basharte ustuwari. Ustuwari means constancy, right? It's not enough to have faith, but when things go bad, it is then that you have to be strong. Wafadari basharte ustuwari asl iman hai. Iman ka asl hai. And the proof of that is that if the Brahman stays true to his faith, then even by the standards of the Kaaba, he has passed a test. Very, very beautifully done and very excellent suggestion. And Anjum, perhaps you could talk about another such share that you incorporated in your book, which spoke to you, if you wish.
Raza, all these three mentioned, they are all in the book. Because like you, we were also very taken with them and with the message that they were conveying, especially in the times in which we are living today. You know, they are very, very relevant. I like the couplets that are at the beginning of the book, because they induce the reader new to Ghalib to this legitimizing this whole process of and also having a particular attitude, critical attitude to authority. You know, that you don't just because somebody is a in some subject, you don't take everything that he or she says for granted. So the first couplet already Amit has mentioned. क्या फर्ज है कि सबको मिले एक सा जवाब, आओ ना हम भी सैर करें कोई तूर की. You know, the way this to a whole tradition and jolts up the reader, because it hits very close to something that they are familiar with in their own culture. I mean, we've used something from other places like Milton, but it doesn't connect in that same way. So in that spirit, I think that the second couplet also appeals to me a lot, where Ghalib says, "Lazim nahi ke khizr ki hum पैरवी बना के एक बुजुर्ग हमें हम सफर मिले." Right. So, which we have explored to say that, okay, even Ghalib is a traveler for us. We hear what he's, but it's not, we follow everything that somebody says blindly. And very, very powerful message as far as critical, just questioning everything, thinking about it on one's own. So those two I like very much. And at this stage, for what follows on the various themes, on the theme that was important to Ghalib and also to Khushwant Singh. If you read his book, it comes back again and again to faith and belief and religion. So those are the ones that we end with. And we structured the book in the first few couplets are quite easy to read and to understand and to become familiar with. And they increase in complexity as we go towards the end. And towards the end, the last one, I think, is the most complex, and Amit likes it. I'd like him to read number 30.
But before that, Raza, were you saying something? I thought, no,
I will connect it. I just, okay, let me just say one thing, that both of them, the points that Anjum mentioned, क्या फर्ज है कि सबको मिले एक सा जवाब, आओ कि आज सैर करें कोहे तूर की. It really connects to the trip that the Prophet Moses made to the Mount Sinai, to the point of Mount Sinai, and where he is where he is believed to have actually communicated with God and got back a reply, which is the Ten Commandments and such. So I think that Ghalib's each share, if you go and kind of plumb it for meaning, then what you do is you end up connecting to a whole tradition. The other one that Anjum mentioned talks about Khizr. Khizr is known to be somebody who shows the way to people, and also somebody who has had a long life. All that simply connects so beautifully. If you know it, that's great. So if you don't know it, the share still makes sense to you. So I think this is the beauty of Ghalib and any poet, that you understand it at one layer, and then you understand it at the second layer, and if you have the guts, then go down and find the third layer as well. So wonderful. Amit, please go ahead and talk about the share number 30.
Yeah, sure. So that's what we end with, and as Anjum said, this has a lot of terminology in it, like the preceding few also. This is the one, हम मुहिद हैं, हमारा केश है तरके रसूम, मिल्लतें जब मिट गईं अज्जाए ईमान हो गईं. I think that is the one Anjum was referring to. That is the last one. So हम मुहिद हैं, we are monists, and हमारा केश है तरके रसूम. So what is religion for us? It is the renunciation of all of these customs, and when these different millats, these communities disappear, they become part of this sort of true faith. Millatein jab mit gayi ajzaye ima ho gayi. And again, it's a verse that you can interpret in a very conventional way, of course, which is always possible. You can say, well, it's talking about Islam, it's talking about communities accepting the faith and so forth. But then it also opens many other possibilities of readings. What are these communities? What is this true faith? Maybe we are talking about, people dissolving their differences and becoming human. The ultimate sort of faith. So he leaves all of those possibilities, open to us, which is what is really wonderful about him. And I just wanted to pick up on one small thing that you mentioned at the beginning, Raza, on the 1857 and the Ghadar and so forth. And this is just in case the viewers are not aware that, you know, Zia Muhyiddin, the fantastic Pakistani actor who has done a lot of readings and recitations, has a wonderful collection of Ghalib's letters that he has read, many of which are also about 1857 too. And, you know, I think seeing, you know, reading those or listening to Zia Muhyiddin recite them, it also gives you a very good insight into how, you know, why Ghalib was writing about all of this the way he was, right? And the changes that he was seeing. You mentioned that he's born, you know, he's born when in fact the British are not even in Delhi, right? This is before the British takeover of Delhi, and then he dies after 1857. So it's a period of profound change, and you can see that he's commenting all those changes. And there are some very, very nice little things I love in those letters, like he's talking about the new postal system, right? And in saying, well, what's this new system that has come? You know, I'm trying to understand it, and it gives you a very good sense of the context in which he's living, you know, and he's communicating with all of these people, the changes that he's seeing. He goes to Calcutta for the first time, he sees what the British have done. And I think all of that kind of comes into his poetry and makes him extremely modern. Like we say in the introduction, he's a very, very modern poet in his concerns and in the way he approaches them and all of that. So just wanted to make that connection.
Yes, and it is very important to understand one thing, that after the 1857 revolt happened, the British responded with a level of violence that was, you know, terrifying. And if somebody had to live there and ply their trade in that matter, they had to be very, very circumspect. Ghalib has written some ash'ar on the Ghadar, but kahin chhape nahi wo. They were put in his khutut. Just to go back to one point that Amit said, the modernity of Ghalib is very apparent in the letters that he wrote. He is perhaps the first person to have carried out a long series of correspondences with a variety of his peers, and in his lifetime, his khutut were collected and published. And so it perhaps is one of the first instances of this form of prose poetry, prose non-fiction in Urdu. And in one of his letters to his friend Hargopal Tafta, he says, he quotes a शेर जिसके चार मिसरे में सुनाता हूँ कि चौक जिसको कहें वो मख्तल है, घर बना है नमूना जिंदा का, इस तरह के विसाल से गालिब क्या मिटे दिल से दाग हिजरा का. You know, that what we used to call the marketplace is right now a battlefield, and therefore we are confined to our houses, and the house has itself become a dungeon of sorts. And now what we thought of as the meeting, as the union of lovers, has become a poignant separation. And so Ghalib actually is one of the historians of 1857. His book called Dastambu, which really encounters the rebellion, which recounts the rebellion, written in Persian, perhaps to evade certain censorship. And you can see some of the encounters of 1857 in there. So that is an extremely, you know, wonderful thing. But to go back to the sher that you quoted, "Hum mubahid hai, hamara kaish hai tarke rusum." You know, this business of, at that point in time, perhaps there were tremendous contestations within Muslims about different kinds of Muslim sects. But because Ghalib went all the way to Banaras and then to Lucknow and then to all the way to Calcutta, in Banaras, of course, he encountered a lot of, you know, Hindu thought. He wrote a very famous Persian Masnavi called Charagh-e-Dair, in which he describes Banaras as such, ke ibadat khana-e nakhusiyan ast, Farsi hai, hamana Kaaba-e Hindustan ast. meaning it is the worshipping ground of conches, the ones that you used to blow, and it is the Kaaba of India. So you can see that he has a tremendous, should I say, affection for this. And then he goes to Lucknow, where of course the Shias, particularly Anis and Dabir, are plying their trade, and he develops a tremendous love for Imam Ali and Imam Hussein, and so he brings in the Shia Sunni element, and all the way to Calcutta. Calcutta, you remember, is a churning in the 19th century where the Brahmo Samaj is coming out, and there the interaction is really between traditional Hinduism and the modernity represented by the Christians and the Britishers. So in some sense, he's imbibing, he's osmotically, getting all this, and then he includes it in his shairi, so that hum wahid hai, hamara cash hai tarke rusum. But the second line is really the hard-hitting one, isn't it? Millatein jab mit gayi, ajzaye ima ho gaye. If you break these boundaries between faith groups, only then you will really find the true faith. So wonderful. And Anjum, maybe talk a little bit more about the book and maybe one of your favorite poems, favorite couplets. One.
Sure. Raza, I just add that about the letters. Ghalib has also talked about the epidemic in those letters. See, in one, I think it is July 1861 to the Majru, in which there is a sher, ho chuki Ghalib balaएं सब तमाम, एक मर गए नागहानी और है. And there he describes the episode. Given that we are at the time of the pandemic, I gives you a sense that this is not the first time that people living and in the Istanbul itself mentioned there is a lot of discussion. People dying. These I think it was a thing that so yes, and sure there are some couplets that are light-hearted and making big points in a very playful manner. को मालूम है जन्नत की हकीकत, दिल के खुश रखो गालिब ये ख्याल अच्छा है. And then the next one that I like even more is कम नहीं जलवागरी में कूचे से बहिश्त, यही नक्शा है वले इस कदर आबाद में. So to me Ghalib across as a philosopher in the garb of a poet, and these are really making a very big major point that indicate very with listeners. I mean, one can read very complex philosophy, but you really need to have a PhD to understand those concepts. But with Ghalib, in 10 words, he can over you. That's the fascinating part about Ghalib.
Indeed. And, you mentioned the maqta of the ghazal that said, Ke ho chuki ghalib balaएं सब तमाम, एक मर्गे नागहानी और है. I never really connected it to the epidemic, but now that you mention it, again, it goes back to the points that Amit was making, that and Anjum as well, कि ये जो ghazal है, it's just should I say a poetic and wordsmithing constraint that is placed by the poet on themselves. Otherwise, the ash'ar are free to discuss different things. So, for example, in the same ghazal that Anjum quoted, the matla goes ke koi din gar zindagani aur hai. Although I have a little more to live, apne ji mein humne thani aur hai. I have other plans for myself. And I particularly like one of the more playful ash'ar of that ghazal that go, de ke khat muh dekhta hai namabar. So you are sending a message, and imagine somebody is giving you the missive, and you've got it, you're reading it, but the person who sent the missive is waiting. De ke khat muh dekhta hai namabar, koi paigam-e zabani aur hai. That there is a further addendum. So sometimes, things should be expressed in words. So that is really beautifully done. And, then immediately very reflective. Ke ho chuki ghalib balaएं sab tamam. So it just shows how much a ghazal goes up and down. When I used to listen to Hindustani music, that I realized that that's what it is. A rag places certain constraints on the musician, but un constraints ke under jo ye log improvise karte hain, that is the true mark of a musician. And since we talked about sending letters, deke khat muh dekhta hai namabar, I wanted to also mention another one ke मगर लिखवाए कोई उनको खत तो हमसे लिखवाए, हुई सुबह और घर से कान पर रखकर कलम निकले. See, this is a very funny one, that my lover has many suitors and they all want to write letters. If they want to write letters to my lover, although they are my rivals, I'm happy to write letters for them, because in the process I actualize my love. So मगर लिखवाए कोई उनको खत तो हमसे लिखवाए, आई एम रेडी, हुई सुबह और घर से कान पर रखकर कलम निकली. So I think that it is a beautiful way in which Ghalib constantly talks about writing letters to the beloved. So हमको मालूम है जन्नत की हकीकत. ये जन्नत की हकीकत क्या है? That there is no heaven, there is no hell. Perhaps this is what Ghalib is saying. हमको मालूम है जन्नत की हकीकत. It's no big deal. And then you put a fulcrum there called लेकिन. हमको मालूम है जन्नत की हकीकत, लेकिन what does it do? The mystery is created, and the second line solves it. दिल के खुश रखने को गालिब ये ख्याल अच्छा है. It does its job. It does its job. This idea of heaven and hell, that it keeps you at least placated. And so that's a very beautiful way in which he puts it forward. Some more, Anjum, anything else that really comes to your mind?
Raza, I want to say a few more things about the book, how it obviously the connection of Ghalib with Khushwant Singh is very obvious and very strong. So I'm glad we talked about that a lot. But at least two other passions of Khushwant Singh that the book resonated. The first is his the importance that he places on friendship. The friendship that rises beyond the constraints of caste and creed and legend, and is centered on interests and passions. So if you read Khushwant Singh, again and again he comes back to Manzoor Qadir, mentioning he was how close of a friendship it was, and how it was beyond any kinds of limitations. And I think that my relationship with Amit started with a passion and an interest, and then grew into something that is not really concerned with anything. And I think that Khushwant Singh would really have approved of that. And the other thing, the way book connects with Khushwant Singh is this whole theme of crossing borders, and the you know, he felt about relations between countries were created, and his emphasis on being human, really the way to resolve differences is not through blows, but through talking to each other, engaging with each other, conversing with each other. And I think that this book illustrates this the crossing of borders, the coming together, the talking. And I think Khushwant Singh would also have approved of that, and that makes me very, very happy and really honored to connect Khushwant Singh to India a number of times. And Khushwant Singh was very important. You know, he was bigger than life. He was very important in our house. I inherited Train to Khan from my father's library. I read it when it sold, and then it went all over. My wife read it. 2 sons read it. Still have that from, you know, like maybe this published somewhere in the 1950s. It's an old thing, still in my library. And when I was looking for it, I found 5 other books by Khushwant, all of them, you know, like here. So it's when I went to India, I tried to meet Khushwant Singh because it's a cool relationship. But my wife, when she was there, in 1991, she didn't have the same compunction. So she got an invitation and did meet Khushwant Singh, and for that was enough of an association. And being on the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival is really a way of coming together, which gives a lot of pleasure.
Thank you. That is really, really wonderful. In fact, if we may connect him to Ghalib in this way, क्योंकि उनका भी एक बड़ा मुनफरिद और बेहतरीन अंदाज था लिखने का खुशवंत साहब का, कि हैं और भी दुनिया में सुखनवर बहुत अच्छे, कहते हैं कि खुशवंत का है अंदाज़ बयां। और इसमें कोई शक नहीं कि these people were very should I say important markers of their time. And yeah, the history of, I mean, reading about the life of Ghalib or the life of Khushwant Singh really puts us in touch with that time, and that is really wonderful. So by way of closing then, Amit, I would like you to you know, give us your final reflections about what your hopes are for this book and what you plan to do going forward.
जी बिल्कुल. So I just want to go back to what Anjum was saying, you know, हम about borders and so forth. हम लोग जिस दौर से अभी गुजर रहे हैं इंडिया में, पाकिस्तान में और जगह पर भी, I think we are going to need all the cultural resources at our disposal to see us through these times and emerge, you know, emerge as what we think our cultures are capable of emerging as. And we see this very much as part of that. You know, Ghalib is one person, but really what the experiment, you know, the sort of South Asian cultural experiment has been over these past hundreds of years, it transcends not only religion but class and many boundaries. So we've got these dialogues going on at every level of society. Right? So somebody like Kabir is talking at a very different level from where Ghalib is talking, but they are deeply engaging with difference and trying to find that human connection which will build a strong society. So, you know, without being too grand about this book, obviously I have no illusions that this book is going to do it. But, you know, for me, it is about that. It's a long fight. I think we are in for a very, very long fight. And we need all the love, you know, that has been produced by people like this. I mean, that's what you see, right? When you read somebody like Ghalib, you just what Anjum was saying, it's wo jo hum zauki hai, which connects people, that, you and I seem to resonate with this one thing. We're going to need a lot of that. And I hope that this book is, one step in that direction.
Yes, indeed. And, both of you have, I would like to, first of all, Anjum, would you like to make concluding remarks? Because then I'll just say a little about your book and close the session.
Raza, just that I hope there's other people to form links and collaborate. We have shown, Amit and I, this has not been mentioned, but we still have not met face to face. We have done all this online through Zoom, etc. And it's possible if people, shared concerns, shared aspirations, we should connect at the level of individuals, and that is how I think we can overcome, the barriers that are in our way. I think that's my
thank you. So this is a very unique collaboration. Therefore, it is a collaboration. ये दो हस्तियां जो हैं, अमित और अंजुम, उनके दरमियान एक बहुत ही गैर ज़रूरी सरहद है. There is a boundary that is beyond, which is unnecessary, at least for the connections that they can develop for themselves. And so I want to conclude by quoting two ashar. Both of them find a place in Anjum and Amit's book. कि पहला तो ये है कि है परे सरहदे इदराक से अपना मस्जूद. That my worship, my place of worship is beyond the boundary of understanding even. So it goes into some spiritual realm, but I want to focus on the fact that it's boundary spanning. है परे सरहदे इदराक से अपना मस्जूद, क़िबला को अहले नज़र क़िबला नुमा कहते हैं. What you think of as the place you want to bow your head is nothing but a compass. It's just showing you the way. And therefore, different groups can find ways in which to cross that boundary. And finally, in closing, I would like to say that what is going on, like Amit said, it's going to require a certain amount of, active pushing back against all the forces that divide us. But it also helps to have an ironic attitude. And Ghalib says, Banakar faqiron ka hum bhes Ghalib. Banakar faqiron ka hum bhes Ghalib, tamashaye ahle karam dekhte hain. That we pretend to be, gestures almost. Faqir here, of course, is somebody who is not really concerned. We pretend to be that, and we just watch the procession of the world as it goes by. I thank Amit and Anjum profusely for the wonderful work they have done in putting out this book, Thinking with Ghalib. And I hope that our listeners enjoyed the session and look forward to having more such sessions in the future. Thank you very much. And a special thanks to the organizers of the Khushwant Singh Literary Festival, and more power to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was really wonderful. And I was privileged to have a look at the book today. And one of the things I really appreciated about it was the fact that you had used different scripts so that the book would be accessible to people from different parts of South Asia, and indeed from London. I'm from the department that had Ralph Russell in it. So Ghalib has been very much around me for a long time in my life. But one thing I would like to say after this wonderful talk is that something about relating it to the Khushwant Singh borders theme, but also to his ecology theme. Because one thing the festival does is, together with Grow Trees, they plant a tree for every speaker at the Kushwant Literary Festival since it began 10 years ago. And this year they are trees for tigers, which are going to be planted in the Sundarbans National Park in West Bengal. And for the younger viewers, it might surprise them perhaps that Anjum Altaf was born in Narayanganj, which is now in Bangladesh, I believe. And those of us who have read Niraj Chaudhary, whose son also taught at my college, are very familiar with Narayanganj. And so this connection, again, we're always seeing these loops and circles, and we go round and we move forwards, but always keeping these connections open. And I think Ghalib, Kushwant Singh and people like you are great ways of connecting us across borders. Many thanks to all of you for such a wonderful and stimulating session today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Hi everyone, I'm Rahul Singh, the son of Kushwant Singh. We began a literary festival 11 years ago in his name in Kasauli, at the Kasauli Club. Kasauli is where he did much of his writing and where there is a family home. Then it went off very successfully. And then a few years ago, we decided that we would move it to London because that is where he studied and where he served as a diplomat and where he imbibed a lot of the values and passions that he held subsequently. We had it physically in London for 2 years, and then sadly the pandemic set in. So we've only been able to have it online. And this year too, it's online. But we've had a marvelous lot of speakers, and the theme is one that I think resonates widely. And the theme is crossing borders. You know, while I was listening to all the speakers, something came to my mind, and that is the iconic song by John Lennon. Because in many ways, it contains many of the elements that we have talked about and the speakers have talked about. So I'll just quote a little bit of that song. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. I hope someday you will join us and the world will be one. No need for greed or hunger, the brotherhood of man. Now, that is something which I find was in almost every session. John Lennon talks about there being no countries, meaning no borders. And that's what we've been talking about. Borders can be terribly cruel, as the session on Ukraine showed us. But borders have to be crossed. There was a session on Ghalib. And there again, I think he would have loved those words of John Lennon, because they have the same sentiment, the same feelings as Ghalib had. And Ghalib and my father had many traits in common. One was irreverence, one was humor, but then also there was friendship. And I think friendship is the theme that covers all our sessions. Friendships between countries, friendship, contacts with everybody. And it's what I think John Lennon also talked about. And here I'd like to sort of also quote another great writer, E.M. Forster, who wrote Passage to India. And in one of his books, he wrote, if a day comes when I have to choose between my friends and my country, I hope I have the courage to choose my friends. Now, that again is something which it was a very bold thing to say, very, very courageous thing to say. And if I said it now, I would be probably accused of sedition. But that's what John Lennon also said. The value of friendship, the value of friendships between all countries, erasing borders, having no countries at all. And this has resonated all throughout our, you know, the Khushwant Singh Lit Fest is really about connecting people. As are all the literary fests. There are so many literary festivals that have come up, and they all connect people all over the world. So on that note, may I now go and thank all the people who made this Lit Fest such a successful one. We have so many partners, speakers and friends to thank for London today. And our speakers, as I've just mentioned, have connected across continents and brought you a range of sessions. The speakers, you can see them all on the screen at the moment there. They've given us marvelous sessions. I mentioned Ghalib. I mentioned some of the others. Now let's just go to the ones who have really helmed, have hosted all our sessions, which is Rachel Dwyer and Fakir Ejazuddin. Know them as Rachel, and Fakir Ejazuddin is popularly or by all of us called Ejaz. So they are the two people who've been with us. Ejaz has been with us right from the beginning, a very close friend of my dad's, and Rachel connects with India for a long, long time. Then we come to Zarir Kama, Zed as he's known as, Indraneil and Mayfair Hotels have been with us since the day we landed in London. Mayfair Hotels hosted our first London physical festival. Zed Kama, and then there is Navtej Sarna, the High Commissioner in London, the Indian High Commissioner in London, who is the one who encouraged us to come to London and have the Lit Fest in London. And he's been our supporter ever since. And then we have the partners who have supported us in many, many ways. This Lit Fest would not have been possible without them. And of course, the most important of all, in many ways, is public funding by the National Lottery through Arts Council England. We are deeply grateful for their support. And two people who gave us the confidence to go for London, Chan and Pushpinder Chaudhary, and their Tongues on Fire, which is the theme of what they do in London. The Cambridge Society, Bombay, Gray's Inn, London, where Dad was the barrister. Special thanks to Professor Satvinder Jas of King's College, London. Then our other supporters and friends, 1469, which is the name of the brand that Harinder and Kiran bring out, and 1469 happens to be the birth date of Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism. And they have been with us since inception, and they have wonderful stores in North India and online. Then there's Vita Botics, Holiday Inn, Wedlake Bell, Mahi Mehra, Homyar Mehta, Barry and Lily Sani, Harki Singh. All these have helped us enormously all throughout. Then Grow Trees, which is thanks to Pradeep Shah. They've planted trees for each speaker at the KSLF. We now have thousands of trees. I recall that when we had Jane Goodall coming here, instead of saying that, you know, this is her fee, we said, can we plant some trees for you? So 100 trees were planted in the Sundarbans in her name, in Jane Goodall's name. So that was the beautiful, wonderful gesture, and she was very, very pleased with that. And this has been a tradition since the inception of the Lit Fest 10 years ago in Kasauli. And to date, we have done about 1,000 trees. Thank you, Pradeep Shah. Thank you very much. And this is the national park in Sundarbans, so that the tigers do not cross their borders, because and hopefully they get more and more numerous, the tigers in the Sundarbans, with more and more trees there. Then our patrons who have been so supportive all through, besides Zed, Navtej, Vikramjit Sani, there's also Baroness Tessa Blackstone and Camellia Punjabi, who've both been very old friends of mine. Camellia friendship goes back to our Cambridge days. And Tessa, when she was very, junior lecturer, I think at the London School of Economics, and then we became friends. Now, of course, she's a member of the House of Lords, Baroness Blackstone. Our advisory board too has many old friends. Imtiaz Dharkar, Samak Tali, Purushottam Dheer, Zarir Masani, TCA Raghavan, who was our former High Commissioner in Pakistan. Then our media partners, Eastern Eye. And then we come, of course, to our wonderful audience. We do all this for you, and you have been our biggest supporters. In Kasauli, we began initially with just about 100 to 200, audience of 100, 200. Last time we had a physical audience of about 1,000, over 1,000 people in Kasauli. So we're hoping to go back to Kasauli again this year, this coming October. Then I would like to thank our amazing team, all volunteers from all over the world, across countries, across borders, as the theme goes, from the UK, Malaysia, Pakistan, and India. It's a totally volunteer-led festival since its inception. And each one brings passion and drive and commitment that I find very heartwarming and quite unprecedented. Niloufar and I get all the credit, but Team KSLF deserves it all because they slog away behind the scenes. A big hand from our audience for Team KSLF. Bharat Avlani, who's been keeping our spirits alive, he's there all the time, every practice session we have, telling us where we can improve. Ashwani, our technical whiz kid, who based in Chandigarh. People say Chandigarh is not known for high-end technology, but you have to see Ashwani to know that Chandigarh is producing some of our best technical people. Our social media team, that's again something new. Social media has become very big. So we have our social media team led by Kiran and Harinder, who I mentioned earlier. They also have the brand of 1469. Pooja, Parneet, Ritika, and Parvinder, Gurvinder, Rishma, Tisha. Then Ashima Bath, who's been our brainwave right from the beginning. She was a great favorite of my father's. And whenever she came over to Raj Villa, he would show her a pile of books that he had received. Take any of them, he would say. So I think Ashima got quite a lot of books from my father, and she's a voracious reader. And she's been an English teacher and who's been with us from the start 11 years ago. Then our media people who have been propagating KSLF all over India and the world. Kishi Singh and Ajay Bhardwaj, Madhur Singh. And then our photographer who's been clicking away pictures. He, I think, must have got thousands of pictures of all the Lit Fest that we've had in Kasauli. They're all available if you want them. Ajay Bhatia. And then there are creatives by Team Paparazzi, Ritika, Gayatri, Shalini, Himani. And Rahul Goba, who's again been with us for a long time. He's always willing to support. Thanks to all of you for the Lit Fest. Well, I've come to the end of this. Crossing borders, as I said, has been a marvelous theme. And we have crossed borders with this Lit Fest. And I hope that more borders are crossed. In fact, I hope that borders are eliminated one day, as just as John Lennon said, as I mentioned right in the start. There should be no countries at all. We don't want any countries. We want one world, and we want the brotherhood of man. He mentioned that also, the brotherhood of man. Thank you very much, everybody, and I look forward to you coming to our next Lit Fest as well. Thank you.